Yes, I had their back. They also had my back. So here we are at a stop, and I've got an irate Blackwater guy, okay, who is escorting a convoy. And Blackwater, they were a disaster, basically losing the war in Iraq, one unnecessary civilian casualty at a time. Every time I met them, they were cowboys and clowns. But this is one of my early encounters, and I've got this guy who's freaking yelling at me about why I've stopped traffic. And of course, the sergeants now they've got this irate Blackwater guy, which normally they would have to deal with. They're not dumb. They have an O5 in the convoy. This is now my problem. So I'm talking to this guy, and he's getting heated, and then I hear this little tink 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 behind me. That sound is the ball bearings on the turret on the gun truck behind me with its 50 caliber rotating to point a 50 cal over my right shoulder. I don't even need to turn around. I know who the gunner is and I know what the gunner's doing. And I noticed this through the immediate change of demeanor on the part of my overarmed, out of control, irate Blackwater dude, because he is no longer having a discussion with this random lieutenant colonel on the street. He is having a discussion with the random lieutenant colonel on the street, suddenly backed by a 50 caliber machine gun. Okay. At which point the discussion pretty much goes to, yeah, okay, we'll wait until you're done. Recording in progress, baby. Bring it on.
Starbaby, welcome back to 10% Truth. Good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Right, this is, let's just get some announcements out of the way, some administration for the audience's benefit before we launch into this, which is part 2 of our Light Attack series. So if you're listening to this, I've just said it's part 2, which means there's a part 1. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go ahead. I'll put a link in the description. Go and watch that before you watch this, because it will make much more sense if you do that. And if you're listening to it and thinking, well, what is the Light Attack series? Then we very briefly will have 5 interviews. This is the second of those 5 interviews. The next one will be with Hanky Cunningham, former F-14D Rio and F-18 Super Hornet Rio, and also a guy who worked with Special Ops on the OV-10 side of things. That's Combat Dragon 2. The 4th interview will therefore be Combat Dragon 3, which was the competition the Air Force launched between Super Tucano and 86. And for that episode, Starbaby and Hanky will come back and discuss together their experiences of that. And then we'll round off with a fifth episode, which will be Starbaby talking us through his weapon systems video from his flying of the 86, which I'm really looking forward to. So that's the flow, that's the plan. If you're listening to this on Spotify, 2 things. Firstly, please drop a comment and subscribe to the feed, and give us 5 stars and do all those sorts of things that help me to gain traction on that platform. But more importantly, this won't make sense, but Starbaby has as his background for the beginning of this interview a picture of himself wearing spandex in front of a palace in Iraq. So you need to come onto YouTube and have a look at that. He actually put that in to spite me, because I said I don't want to use that, and so therefore his response was to use it. So thank you. Hey, and also, if you're watching this, if you're watching the YouTube version of it or the video version of it, you'll notice that Starbaby looks trimmer and younger, and I look fatter and older. But there's only really been a week between the first episode and the second episode. So how does that work? Well, the answer is that, of course, Starbaby is the equivalent of Benjamin Button in that he ages in reverse and will probably die looking like a baby. But more importantly, it's because we recorded part 1 about 1.5 years ago. So this has been sitting, waiting to go for about 1.5 years. And the long and short of it is that I'm just really excited to get moving with it. So that's it from me. I don't think I have anything else to say. Starbaby,
No, but I do.
Okay, go ahead.
I actually met an 11-year-old fan in Germany while I was there a couple weeks ago, Jack. So I just wanted to give a shout out. And also apologize in advance for any words I'm teaching him that his parents don't want him to know.
Is Jack German?
Pardon?
Is he German? Jack is German?
No, he's not.
Okay.
He just lives there.
Okay. All right. Okay. So it's not like he could use those words and his parents wouldn't know what they are because they're German speakers. His
dad taught him to me in the first place. No big deal.
Well, Jack, hi from the UK as well. Nice to have you as a fan of Starbabies. Hopefully, by extension, you're a fan of the channel. I don't know. If you are, drop a comment. Let us know. Be interested to find out. All right. Anyway, Starbaby, get on with it. Start talking. Do some stuff.
Okay. So when we left this tale, I had just gotten to Baghdad, and of course that's one of the palaces in the complex on Baghdad. And I had just been attached to the COIC, which was the counter IED center that they set up in the Al Faw Palace. And we'd prearranged this with the army. The reason for me to go to the COIC and to be attached there was to use it as a base to go outside the wire and actually accomplish my mission. Well, the director of the COAC was a Army '06 Cav officer who we do not name, other than by the way we refer to him, which is Sauron. So I mentioned in a previous episode that I worked for Satan. I've also worked with Sauron, although the handiest phrase I had during my whole time in Iraq was, "There are no army officers in my chain of command," which was true and the most useful phrase I had. So just to set the stage, is we had the ultimate in toxic personalities. His poor deputy was a British artillery officer doing his second 20 years. And so naturally, we dubbed him the mouth of Sauron because he had to come out and say stupid shit on behalf of the '06. Everybody who's been there knows exactly who I'm talking about. Guy, he had like really silver gray, high quality hair. He had a lean and hungry look that would have made Cassius look like a fat slob. And he had the nasty habit of sticking his hands down the front of his pants anytime he was engaged in extended conversation with you. So that was not the best environment. So I cut a deal. Said I would do a 50-page analysis of classified analysis of Iraqi insurgents groups, and then he would essentially help me get outside and do the mission. And so I accomplished that analysis in record time. It was actually good for me. I wish I still had it. But it was a good education on my part. And of course, he immediately reneged on the deal, and I said, "Screw it, I'm out of here." And I moved over into a different palace, essentially in the Air Force House, and went to work with a different set of folks, and then started hanging around with the JTACs. But while I was in Baghdad, I started engagement with combat engineers. So I basically bicycled across the base, and I hooked up with the combat engineers, and I said, "Hey, this is my mission. Can I join your patrols in Baghdad?" And they said, "Sure," not knowing quite what they were getting. Um, and they're kind of uneasy because, the highest ranking officer on a normal patrol is a captain. More likely it's a lieutenant. Okay, and here's this lieutenant colonel fighter guy, walking around. But like anything else I did in Iraq and Afghanistan, I changed the perceptions of me by telling stories. So I enter, and of course, I'm a lieutenant colonel. These are guys who may go through an entire 3-month tour and not see their own battalion commander, who would normally be the first lieutenant colonel in their chain of command. Um, and so I need to shift them away from a thought process that treats me like a lieutenant colonel and towards a process where they enter the imaginary realm of what they think fighter aviation is like. And so I do that by telling a couple stories. And they're flying stories and they're air show stories, and um uh let's just leave it at that. They're stories. And after a short period of time, the paradigm changes. Okay, yes, I'm still an '05, but I'm really the first fighter guy that these guys have ever met. And at that point, once they shift their paradigms, they realize that I'm there to learn, and most of them realize that they are capable of teaching me and that I'm happy to be taught. If a private first class wants to explain to me why he drives his Humvee the way he drives it when he's going under bridges, I'm happy to hear it, even if I already know the answer, because that's my goal. It's to get guys to teach me things. And at Baghdad in 2007, there were a number of training efforts that had been made. So the Puerto Rico Army National Guard had set up an IED, so an improvised explosive device, what we all call roadside bombs, set up the training course. So you could go through a 1-week course and it would tell you, this is what they look like. This is how they're laid out. Here, hold an example of one. Yes, it's been disarmed. And you go through the training course. So the Puerto Rico Guard, their combat engineers during a rotation, set up this whole facility. And then combat engineers would come in and they'd rotate out. So I would basically hook up and go on patrol through all the neighborhoods in Baghdad west of the river. I did all of them and did all of them, most of them quite a bit. And so, unfortunately, I've lost or I don't have on this computer some of the photos, but I'll show you some others from other neighborhoods. But what engineers would do regularly is they would do patrols in which they would just go out over the same route over and over again, different timing, but same route, and they look for changes. And we all got to a really good point is, where you could recognize the neighborhood and you could recognize day to day changes to the neighborhood. And that was the secret. The sensor for countering your embedded IEDs was to be familiar enough with your entire patrol route that you could detect any changes that might be a threat. And I'm going to show you some examples when I bring up the slides. And we would go around in protected vehicles. And I think with that point in the introduction, let's see if I can share some slides and see what we get to.
Just before you do that, Starbaby, can you just give us a 30-second précis of what your objectives are then? So if there's a possibility somebody won't bother going back and listen to part one. So why are you there?
Oh, I should say the heck with them. Go back and listen to part one. Okay, so the reason I'm there is because I have argued since the demise of Horned Owl that the Air Force is not putting their best foot forward in terms of air support. Not in terms of close air support, but in terms of providing capabilities from the air that can assist the guy on the ground. And my theory is that the way you need to do this is you need to put experienced aviator instructors on the ground embedded with ground forces, not in a JTAC or a liaison officer role, so that you essentially have somebody who's willing to walk a mile in the Army's combat boots and understand the conditions that they are facing from their point of view, and then say, oh, well, we can use air power to help that. So I went through the Army Asymmetric Warfare Group is a very interesting organization full of amazingly talented people, most of them special operations background. They were at Fort Meade in the prison, actually. They had, I think, five squadrons within the regiment. And they put me through the same combat skills training that all their people came through as they went in. So that taught me basic shoot, move, communicate stuff so that any ground team I embedded with was not going to be endangered. But in terms of skill set, I never went to infantry school. So it's at best, I'm a private first class with much better marksmanship skills, much improved situational awareness, and no knowledge of tons of things that infantrymen do. There are things that I know because I know my own limitations to stay away from hand grenades. So when given the opportunity to throw hand grenades, I turned that right down. Because my throwing skills are nothing to brag about. And, in under those conditions, why throw a hand grenade? If I'd been a high school quarterback or, the star pitcher of a baseball team, hand grenades all the way. But I know from experience that I can be beaten in a backroom frozen ravioli fight by the pitcher from the girls' softball team. So given those throwing skills, grenades are right out. So there's lots of things like infantrymen. I did not know how to clear a room with a 4-person stack. I had to be taught that with asking the questions. So there's tons of things I don't know, but there's also tons of things I do know in terms of counterinsurgency ops and air power ops and sensors that your average guy doesn't. So I had convinced General Warden, Mike Warden, who was the director of the Air Force Weapons Center at Nellis. I was assigned to the Irregular Warfare Center of Excellence at Nellis, which and I convinced him that we needed to put a guy on the ground running around with a rifle. And he said, okay, you're up. And General North, who was he was the CFAC at the time, said, Starbaby, you're in, man. And so off I go to Iraq and try to negotiate a way so that I can actually get out and see what's going on so that there's a direct line of communication back without all the filters in order that we, the Air Force, can look at how we provide support from the air to the ground component. More than 30 seconds, but
it was. Can I do a follow-up question for you then?
No. Yes, of course you can.
So the caveat being that we did record episode 1 a year and a half ago. I did watch parts of it back recently because I thought I should know roughly what we talked about. I don't know whether or not in that conversation, we got to the point of defining ALO, Air Liaison Officer, or JTAC. And when you were just saying, you know, what we need to do probably is embed a aircrew instructor level individual with the army. The first thing I thought was, I thought ALOs were supposed to be embedded with the army. And the second thing I thought was, well, aren't JTACs attached to infantry units or ground units? Maybe best known for working with special forces, but so those are the two things that came to mind. Now, I don't want to derail you, so you may get to those points later, in which case continue. But if you're not going to get to those points, could you give us your opinion?
Yes, I have neither rails nor guardrails, so no problem. So the air liaison officers have been, this dates to at least the Second World War, Air Force aviators who were embedded in Army units. It used to be we had specific squadrons for that with aircraft. They were the Tactical Air Support Squadrons, the TASs. So when Spike Benešek flew OV-10s, or when Dave Lucia flew OV-10s, they were in a TAS. Those went away, and we got Air Support Operations Squadrons, which are a mix of air liaison officers and JTACs. And JTACs are Joint Terminal Attack Controllers. These are mostly, at the time, they were almost entirely enlisted. It took us a while to build an officer career path for that. And so these were guys who were specialists in calling in aerial support in order to support the Army or the Marine Corps if the Marine Corps didn't bring their own. But you can have Navy JTACs, you can have Air Force JTACs. The Army tends to use JFOs, Joint Fire Officers, which isn't quite as high as a qualification as a JTAC is. NATO JTACs are trained to the same standard. The Aussie and Kiwi JTACs meet U.S. standards. So it also became a way for NATO partners to contribute to the air power fight with professional, well-trained aviators in a way when they couldn't bring a lot of Air Force capabilities to Iraq or Afghanistan in support of those coalitions. So the difference between my role and a JTAC role is that I'm not calling in fires, although I could have under the emergency CAS rules. I never needed to. Nobody ever needed me to. And that my mission is different from that. So these guys are experts in delivering fire. You know, I'm more of an expert in the general application of air power. Yes, I'm a fighter guy. Yes, I can do close air support. Yes, I have. But I'm going well beyond that capability. So that's the nutshell. Those guys are embedded, but they're embedded in an air support role. They are not embedded as riflemen at the squad or platoon level. And that's what I was doing. So for military police, infantry, or mostly combat engineers, I would embed as a rifleman. A totally different perspective.
Okay.
Plus, it meant I didn't have to carry around all those radios. I mean, JTACs, poor guys. I mean, they carried all the equipment that an infantryman carries, and then they add radios, batteries, antennas. And it's a nightmare. I mean, if your most heavily laden guys were the JTACs.
Okay. Good to know.
All right, so now I'm going to share, and this is just to open up. So this on the left is me being professional, and I have no idea who took this photo, but I'm in the Alpha Palace somewhere with a whole bunch of other officers sitting down and watching something, and I am obviously bored out of my mind and completely undercaffeinated. On the right side is me being less professional, with my Han Solo style drop holster, and what I'm holding is an empty bottle of Arrogant Bastard Ale. So Arrogant Bastard Ale is from the Stone Brewery in California, and it was my traditional promotion present for years. Somebody, one of my fighter buds would get a promotion, and I would give them a bottle of Arrogant Bastard Ale. And that applied even to guys that pinned on 4 stars. It's 22.7% beer. Like all beers, it's no doubt disgusting, but other people seem to like it. No, sorry. No, it's 22 ounces. It's the alcohol content is high for a beer, but I don't remember the number. And they had a little competition at the time. Show us your picture of Arrogant Bastard Ale. So I had a bottle of empty, because remember, General Order 1 can't have alcohol in theater, unless you're general officer because they don't feel themselves bound by their own orders. And so I had a picture taken in front of the palace with me holding arrogant bastard ale for the competition. I think I should have freaking won hands down, but I never heard a word from them, pansies. Um, so and you will note, as I told in the first episode, you will note that I'm wearing a tan flight suit, solid green ammunition pouches, and I think this is an army pattern camouflage hat. No, it might be my Air Force Tiger Stripe one, same color scheme. I finally got that. Aviator shades. This is essentially my combat uniform. Even when I go outside the wire, I just add body armor and swap the hat for a helmet. Baghdad. We're going to talk about Baghdad. This is what Baghdad looks like. This is a shot I took out of a Black Hawk helicopter heading north when I was flying over the neighborhood and thought to myself, I recognize all these intersections because I had been on patrol in them. I recognized them from the air, so I took a picture. A lot of suburbs. It's kind of a dusty green, but there's plenty of foliage. This is what it looks like over most of the city. The thing that's missing that you can't see that's obvious in this particular neighborhood is that at the time the electricity grid had largely collapsed, and so there was a lot of local setup electricity grid. So there's webs of wires going everywhere, which brings in its own set of problems. So with that in context, I want to talk about patrols, but I'll pause to give you question time.
The one question that I was thinking about, maybe because I'm a bit dull, was weather. So, being a Brit, I think of Iraq as sunny and sandy and dry and what you would expect in the Middle East. But I know it can also be cold, and it can. I think it can even snow in the desert. So, when you were there, what were the conditions like?
So they varied. So I was there from a hot point in summer, all the way around to January. So I actually saw pretty much most of what they had to deliver. And in 2007 over to 2008, there were some definite changes. So it doesn't rain a lot, but when it does rain, there's some pretty serious thunderstorms. And I'm going to go into a story right off naturally on thunderstorms. When I was there, we got enough snow to cover the ground, which was a shock. January 2008 was the first time there was enough snowfall to give a quarter inch of snow to completely cover the ground. That was the first
Wow.
time in living memory in Baghdad. Up in the north, Iraqi Kurdistan, around near Mosul, Talafar, that's colder. That's where you start hitting the mountains, and annual snowpack is a regular thing. In the south, you're more towards the Gulf. You get a lot more humidity, but it is largely a desert environment. But remember, this is the Fertile Crescent that you learned about in your history books. So the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are the key to life in Iraq,
Hmm.
and so there's tons of palm trees, which is mostly palm trees. There's scrub brush all over the place. It's not like the Saudi empty quarter, which is there is nothing but sand dunes, and the occasional Bedouin going someplace else. Uh, the it's a living desert.
Okay.
In Monty Python terms, you could say, "Bring me a shrubbery," and somebody could come up with one.
So tell us, are you going to tell us the thunderstorm story now or later?
Yeah, no, I'll tell you now because
Okay, go
otherwise
on.
I'll forget.
Yeah.
When you're intensely ADD, you might as well just go stream of consciousness. So there I was. I'm in my hooch. Now I have like 1/3 of a trailer. I have to myself, one person. It's got good air conditioning. I finally get internet set up by putting an internet antenna at the top of my very tall concrete T-walls. Um, and I'm reasonably comfortable. I've got a great table, steel legs, a thick plank tabletop. That's my ad hoc bomb shelter. It's 2 o'clock in the morning one day, and all of a sudden I hear boom. And I'm rolling out of bed, grabbing my helmet, and I am under the table before I'm fully awake because somebody has just freaking blown the gate. And so I'm waiting to see what happens, and there's boom, and it's like that's the follow-up. That's exactly what I expected. And I hear the debris that is now hitting from the second explosion that is now hitting the roof of my trailer. And suddenly my brain catches up with me, and I go, "That's rain, you dumbass." And sure enough, there are giant raindrops just falling out of the sky. They are so big that in the dust, they were actually making impact craters. So you had little wet impact craters is the first thing you see when the stuff comes down. So, like many people, I'm not necessarily my best when waking out of a sound sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. My brain finally catches up and I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm. It doesn't last for a long time, but holy cow, is that loud.
Wow.
Yeah. So again, it when you're in an environment like this, there are certain reactions that change. You start worrying about things that you didn't worry about. Trash on the side of the road becomes a big worry. Loud noises are a big worry. I mean, two subsequent loud noises, I knew somebody had just blown the gate.
Hmm.
No, dumbass, that's thunder.
Just tell us a little bit, if you will, and again, if you plan to discuss this as part of the ongoing sort of presentation, then don't worry about it. But so you want to be embedded with the guys, you want to learn from them, and you want to go out on patrol with them. You want to understand the world as it looks to an infantryman or infantrywoman if they were there at that time, whatever. Um, do you have expectations as to what you're going to find? I mean, are you sort of really approaching this with a very strict, almost academic-like methodology where you're not going to, um, necessarily prejudice yourself by having those expectations? You're just going to see what comes to you. Are you in search of proof points for things you think you already know? And what are you actually going to do? What is your plan other than going out on patrol? What is your actual plan?
Plan. So I'm entering this as if it's a learning experience. I'm entering on the assumption, which I think was the right approach to take, that I actually don't know anything. Or that possibly that I have negative knowledge, which I define as everything I know about the subject is wrong. So, and when I later went into Afghanistan after Iraq, I had a different set of expectations, which I needed to adjust because Afghanistan is not Iraq. But the first time out, it's like I definitely need to learn this, and my job is to be a sponge. So I went in with very little in preconceived notions. What I did know is that I needed to get outside the wire, and I needed to operate with certain types of units because I needed to see the corners.
Yeah.
And one of those, the reason that combat engineers and MPs are so important in my scheme of things are that Iraq at the time was divided up into medieval style baronies, where each brigade commander was the baron. Okay, and we refer to those guys, they're cav brigades or they're infantry brigades or their armor in some cases. They're the landowners. So because if you're a landowner, you have to define the boundaries. So their boundaries are strictly defined. Military police and combat engineers, they're not landowners and they have to cross those boundaries all the time. And so you're more likely to see the seams in the big picture when you are dealing with the rovers rather than with each of the individual baronies. So think of them as knights errant, where
Mhm.
they're just running around and I'm just following along, Panza on his donkey, um, trying to see whether or not that's really a windmill.
Did you have then? I guess that excludes special forces then, special operations types. But
It does. Special ops are a special case, and they they're also much more of a unified organization because they get first call in terms of what capabilities they can bring to bear. They get first call on air power. So conventional forces fairly regularly see an AC-130 gunship. It is Air Force Special Operations Command providing support to other elements of Special Operations Command. So one, they don't need my observation because they're already doing things in their own way. In the same way that a Marine Air to Ground task force isn't going to benefit from my observations. The problem is with conventional forces. And so we have to find our own solutions. There was a lot of resentment from conventional forces among the conventional forces for the special forces because they believed that special forces stole their air power all the time. And I had to do a lot of explaining in a lot of places that Special ops, while they did have first call if they needed it, they were essentially apportioned their own air power. They did not, always steal from everybody else. But if they got in trouble, they were the highest priority and they would call everybody else's air power.
Yeah.
Um, but to be fair, if those conditions were reversed and, an army unit were in danger of being overrun, it's entirely possible you could see Air Force Special Operations Command coming in to lay down some fire.
Okay.
So it's all based on, it was silly, but it was one of the things I spent a lot of time explaining was how air power is apportioned to various ground units, and that special ops are not really stealing your air power, although maybe you would like better tailored air power. So without hesitation, when you ask a soldier what kind of air support he wants, it's A-10s and AC-130s.
Mm.
And they understand A-10s because they see them. The AC-130 is kind of like the gunship fairy, right? You're kind of hoping the gunship fairy shows up and puts a couple 40 millimeter rounds under your pillow. Uh, that was more mythical than anything else.
And final question then, and then I'll let you get on with it. Otherwise, you'll never finish. Just while you're doing this, then initially you talked about Sauron. So the army knows you're there. Is there anybody in the army saying, well, we should do this in a reciprocal fashion? We should be, once you're done, let us come and spend some time with you in a fighter squadron or at Nellis in the asymmetric warfare group. Is there a sort of a meeting of minds happening, or does that happen at any point?
It is not a meeting of minds because the view at the time was the army is joint, therefore all joint powers are there to support the army. No, but I saw one brigade, and unfortunately, sorry guys, I can't remember which brigade it was. They were up based around Tikrit, so Cobb's Spiker, and they had set up their own mini air operations center so that at the brigade level within their territory they could effectively manage and monitor the air picture.
Wow.
The downside of that is that they didn't tell anybody in the Air Force that they were doing it until the last month of their deployment. So I showed up and, I'm walking around and I'm there with the ASOS commander, the Air Support Operations Squadron commander, who happens to be a space guy, not coming out of fighter history, with a J-Stars guy also available. And they look at this and they go, this is a mini air operations center. This is freaking great. Everybody should do this. And the army said, yeah, hey, everybody should, but we're out of here in 4 weeks. Thanks for your time. Totally legitimate. But so, yes, there was some learning, but it was brigade by brigade, new sheriff in town and everything changes.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see where we are. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Baghdad. And I mentioned a couple things. So if you look in the upper left, that's what I mean by the spaghetti wiring going around. So if you can see between the bar armor slats on the Buffalo, which I'll show you a picture of later, there's wires every which way, which is a challenge. And a challenge multiple ways because this is how everybody gets their electricity for the time that they can get it. So they're setting up little power co-ops. And so what you end with a little power co-op is you end up with what you've got in the lower right, is you've got a little generator that's down there. And they're running it off of whatever fuel the generator runs off of, and people pay to get that generated power. And you see them all the time. They're surrounded by fencing. They're full of flammable materials. There's something you need to pay close attention to. Now, it's unlikely that insurgents are going to blow up the electricity system because that's going to piss off the neighborhood really quickly, but it can't be ruled out. This is what the roads looked like in 2007. Later on, all the guardrails would disappear, but the guardrails were hiding points for explosive devices. So, and there's a trash problem. There's trash everywhere along the highways in Iraq. So the upper left, a yellow circle, a white box. So what is that? Okay, is it a bomb? Is it trash? Odds are it's trash, but you don't survive this experience in Iraq by playing the odds because the odds are also you're going to pass a lot of things that look like trash and may not be. And in which case, there's a box there. Am I hiding the wire in a guardrail? Am I hiding the sensor in a guardrail? Is there a 122 millimeter artillery shell mounted behind that guardrail to add, bonus? So this is your typical median in Iraq. And you will note on the other side in the lower right that the traffic is going the other way. The Iraqis were amazingly adept at adopting their traffic patterns on the fly based on the presence of an American vehicle convoy. Because we didn't like to get guys too close, and they didn't like to be too close to us. Because if somebody's going to make the Americans explode, why would you want to be next to them? So really, you can say a lot of things about drivers in the Middle East, but the guys were adaptive, and I never saw anybody crash as
Hmm.
they were, winding this together in real time.
Quick question just before you move on. The posts, were they taken out by the Americans, the coalition, because they were being used to hide IEDs, or were they taken by locals who wanted the metal for something?
Yes and yes.
Okay, right. I love it when I'm right.
Um, so this is an example. This is one of the patrol routes, northwestern Baghdad. This building, I mean, it looks kind of nice. It's pockmarked with bullet holes. Well, if I see a building that pockmarked with bullet holes, I think that's got to be an Iraqi police station, right? And somebody's been shooting at them. It's not an IP station. So was it an ambush point before? Is it an ambush point now? This is in the height of the day. This is bright sun. All of those windows and doorways, they're in deep shadow. That's why I carried binoculars on the front of my body armor, was because it gave me the ability to look into deep shadow. Why is this door open? Now, this pass on this building was completely benign. There was no threat. But the reason I took a picture of it was because I thought, oh, well, this sucks. Um, and I wanted to have evidence for training purposes.
Mm.
The shoulders. This is what the shoulders look like. So, what if the shoulders are uneven? What does it mean? Is there something that's been buried recently? How do you tell if the gravel has been disturbed? It's gravel. And what about the low cover? Well, the advantage of having brush there is green brush indicates it probably hasn't been disturbed, because if you disturb the brush, the grass, it's going to die pretty quick if you damage the roots. But still, it's still low cover. You look on the right, that's high cover. Okay, that's a variety of bamboo, growing along a trench. That's dense. And then you see concrete debris everywhere. So as you started seeing T-walls proliferate, concrete walls proliferate, that also meant there was a proliferation of damaged and destroyed concrete walls. And what did you do with that? You didn't haul it off to the central dump. You dumped it right there. So we end up with concrete debris all over the place. It's another threat. This is a sign I saw. No VBID parking, so vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. So no car bomb parking is what that's saying. That was on the asymmetric warfare group's office, I think, near one of the palaces, and I copied it. Later had some copies made with a occupational safety and health explosion symbol on it. The company that did it for me, did it at cost. So I donated one to the Army Asymmetric Warfare Group, and then I've got one somewhere in my house. And, on my retirement I Love Me wall will be a version of that sign.
Awesome.
Possibly outside my garage. All right, so one of the interesting things we got in Iraq, and this was something you really needed a fighter guy for, as stupid as this sounds. We're always getting callouts from fighter aviators who are trying to help us out, okay? And they're reporting a hot spot on the road in front of us. So if it's a puddle, it's probably cold. If it's a hot spot, is it disturbed ground? Well, actually, recently disturbed ground will probably also be cold. What is a hot spot? It's a threat. We got to call it out. Tell the Army there's a hot spot on the road in front of them. The vast majority of time, it's a freaking dog. Okay? There are dogs everywhere in Iraq. They're wandering around, and they lie down in the middle of the freaking road. And so we were getting constant hotspot reports that the Air Force and the Marine Corps aviators that support us were unable to resolve. Army Apache pilots probably knew about it, but hadn't communicated it anywhere. So there I am on the ground, and I'm passing this up to AFCENT. It's like, dude, they're dogs. These hotspots are dogs. So here you've got a wandering dog, okay? But and she is not always going to be wandering. And when she lays down, she's going to lay down next to a pile of trash. And a fighter's going to say, geez, pile of trash for the hotspot. You guys need to look out for that. Thanks, dude. It's a dog. Um,
Serious question. Did they ever make any attempts to use animals as IEDs?
Not that I ever saw, which is great because it leads me into this slide. So livestock, if you see livestock running around, you're probably safe. Livestock are valuable, potentially more valuable than humans. And so they tended to not be they tend to be an indication that you were not about to be ambushed. To the right, there's command wire wrapped around that telephone pole. Can you see it? I can't see it either. That was detected by the Mark 1 eyeball of the guy in the right front seat of the Buffalo. That's that empty tire there. You can't see what's inside that. You know, that fits up to a 155 millimeter round. And in Baghdad, and particularly north of Baghdad, between Baghdad and Tikrit, even up as far as Cobb Summerall, the the road was not so much a collection of asphalt as it was a series of repaired blast craters with little bits of asphalt connecting it. And so here, there's a filled-in blast crater right freaking there. So there is command wire running up to that post, and I'll show you another picture of command wire
How
in a
fast?
second.
How fast are you driving when you're taking these snaps? Are you zooming through these
No,
spaces?
hell no, we're on patrol. We've got to eyeball everything. We're 10 to 15 miles an hour.
Okay. And do you ever stop?
Yep. We stop anytime we think there's a threat, and we deal with it one way or another.
Okay.
It's what engineers are there to do. Combat engineers are there to, build obstacles or make obstacles and clear them. That's their thing. Another look at Baghdad. Again, another Apache shot. So, mosque towers. Um, you get this is as you get to the denser part of the center of the city, you see more built up. But this is not a collection of skyscrapers. This is just where you move from the 2 and 3 story zone into the, 4 and 6 story zone. Kids will always wave at you, and we will always wave back. And this is an interesting picture, not because that little girl always waved at us if she was out. It's because that's like the only pickup truck in the entire freaking country that is not a white Toyota. All right, and before I disconnect the temporary slides, this is a Buffalo. This is the IED hunting vehicle of choice. It has a V-shaped hull. It is designed to roll over a 500-pound explosive and take it.
Wow.
It has bulletproof windows. In this case, it's got bar armor. It's got a robotic arm with a camera array. And most importantly, it has really, really good air conditioning. So it is the ride. Obviously, it has a suspension that you would expect from something that's designed to shrug off explosions, so it rides like a Cadillac. It is a nice, monstrous vehicle. This is an RG-31. And so this was one of the MRAPs that we got. Of course, it's got a gun turret, gunner up top, basically positions for 5 people. And that is a very common patrol vehicle. Everybody uses them as soon as they could get away from Humvees that were death traps. You're going to note that the RG-31 in the background has what looks like an air duct bolted to the front bumper. I'll show you a better picture of that later. These are Huskies. Okay, so the Husky on the left has a blower on it. The Husky on the right has a robotic arm. And this is referenced me and not as you're looking at it, not as you were sitting in it. These are one-person vehicles where the front end is the same as the back end for repair, V-shaped hull. They're often the point on a patrol because they're designed so that if it blows up, it's easy to fix and the one guy in the top is protected. So I've seen a Husky hit an IED. I saw the smoke just go up on both sides of the vehicle. It was a V-shaped smoke cloud. And the dude, we went over there to extract him because the vehicle was immobilized and he had hurt his pinky.
Wow.
That was in Afghanistan, so that comes later. This is a death trap. Okay, this is an up-armored Humvee with Frag Kit 5 and a Rhino bar on the front and electronic warfare gear and the gunner station. It has a flat bottom. If you hit an IED, chances are everybody in that vehicle is seriously wounded or dead.
Hmm.
And by this time, we had added so much weight. I mean, driving one of these is horrific. Um, if you took one of the chow hall, you wanted to back in so that you could drive out forward because trying to back this out of a parking lot, it if you can imagine driving a cinder block with a big water tank on top of it, that's what driving one of these things is like.
Really?
Um, well, yeah, why they let me drive one is completely beyond me, but it was, kind of like all we had. Give the officer a freaking car. And it's got extra armor panels on it, but if it hits a mine, everybody in there is seriously out of luck. Okay, so that's where I'm gonna stop the sharing because I'm gonna, you know, wrap up a couple discussions in Baghdad. So I'm patrolling Baghdad regularly. I'm getting to learn it was fairly quickly that the combat engineers discovered uh well, I discovered a couple things about them. One is I liked guard units a lot. And the reason I like guard units was because they weren't all 22-year-old soldiers with a very limited out of high school skill set. If you needed a welder, you had one. If you needed an auto mechanic, you had one. If you needed a math teacher, you had one. A lawyer, teacher's aide, you had one. Car salesman, that's what guard units look like. They tend to be older. Now the conversation is different. Your 22-year-old group of soldiers will talk about um, like video games, Tiger Woods golf, their score on Call of Duty, and they will. If that discussion is totally different in a guard unit, because guards are drawn from states, and a unit can also be pretty local. You're getting the full story on the most recent divorces, who's sleeping with who beat up who else's brother-in-law, because they disrespected your sister. Um, you know, what principal of what school is sleeping with which teachers? You get a totally different level of conversation. Um, and I'll tell some guard unit stories. But the other thing is that it takes very little time for me to be promoted up to the lead vehicle. So it's shortly that I'm in the point vehicle. And so I pointed out to the guys, I said, okay, so one of two things is happening. Either you're confident enough in my abilities that you can put my eyeballs up in the lead vehicle, or two, you're trying to get me killed. But what was happening is that the engineer units were all asking me which patrols I wanted to go on. So it's one of the things, it's a minor point of pride throughout this, is that I was never with a unit that didn't ask me to go out more than I did. They always asked me back. And, and my job in a vehicle, so let's take an RG 31, for example. We've maybe got four people. So we've got the pilot, we've got the truck commander in the right seat, the pilot, the driver, the truck commander in the right seat. You've got the gunner up top, and there's me. Okay, we're all on headsets, we're all connected in the interphone. What's my job? I have two freaking jobs. One, I am the snack meister and bartender. So we used to save up these little cans of Rip It, which were energy drinks. Is you'd only take two cans out of the chow hall every meal, two cans of whatever, and or two milks. Like we were going to take milk out of the chow hall in 120 degrees, right? So you kind of stock up on Rip Its because they were your energy drinks. You didn't have Red Bull handy unless you paid for it. So you're stocking up on these to go out on patrol. And so my job is to hand out the Rip Its, or if we stash a bunch of snacks, or I was the guy that was going to hand up the ammo. So the first thing I ask for the gunner is, how do you want your ammo can? And this sounds like it's a stupid question, but some guys wanted it fully closed. Some guys wanted it open. Some guys wanted it open with the first set of links hanging out. Just figure out what the gunner wants. And when the gunner calls for ammo, bang, there's going to be a box of ammo. And they're going to know exactly where to look for it because I have one freaking job if the gunner's calling for ammo. And so that's kind of my role, but I'm an extra set of eyeballs. And in the meantime, I'm going to tell stories, keep them awake, and I may talk about counterinsurgency doctrine. I may do a lot of teaching in that. So I noticed though that among the engineers were never short of Rippets. They were never short of these little energy drinks. And I said, guys, why are you never short of Rippets? And I've got a specialist for, no, maybe a little higher ranking, but a specialist looking at me and saying, well, sir, we're engineers. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, we go up to the storage area, we cut the fence, we take all the Rippet we need, and then we fix the fence like we were never there. This is routine engineer stuff. I asked, and I was talking to same conversation. I said, well, and I guess you guys having a spare. He said, yes, sir. I said, last night we had a Rip drinking contest. I said, you can't do that. You'll end up with heart palpitations. Well, sir, as it turned out, was smart enough to stop when I realized I could no longer feel my lips. I love these guys. I mean, I saw a guy in a relatively new uniform. I said, hey, is that one of the new Nomex fireproof uniforms? He goes, hold on, sir. Pulls a lighter out of his pocket, lifts up his arm, sees a stray thread, tries to set it on fire, does not light. Yes, sir, it's Nomex. Thank you. Thank you very much. So obviously they're comfortable with me because they're telling me stupid stuff. And I'm learning a lot. And occasionally we would stop out in the city. We would stop at Iraqi army posts. And so the one of my favorite encounters with his Iraqi private who actually spoke pretty good English. And he looks at me, and I refer back to the first photo, and he cannot believe he doesn't recognize my rank. He's never seen a lieutenant colonel in the field. He goes, what are you? I said, a lieutenant colonel. He goes, really? He goes, Iraqi colonel. And he mimes this. And then Iraqi captain. That's how he viewed his own officers. Now, at the same time, the guy was trying to talk me out of my watch, which he wasn't getting. But I might very well have given him a patch. But yeah, so we'd stop at Iraqi army posts. The Iraqi army, didn't particularly they were not necessarily going to be helpful, but I never actually was uncomfortable around them. I never felt like we had to be on guard with those guys.
Hmm.
So, we're going through the neighborhoods. We occasionally do some tourism, go out to the green zone, which is the fortified area with the embassy. And the reason you go out to the embassy is because they have make your own panini presses. And at least until September, they had a soft ice cream machine that worked. So that's good. Those are good enough reasons to go to the embassy, aside from the fact they have a pool. But there are monuments in the green zone. And so at the time, the units of currency were Doritos and bottles of Gatorade. So I went to the Iraqi Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and it was off limits to casual visitors. And there are Iraqi privates guarding it. And, a bag of Doritos and 2 bottles of Gatorade, and that guy turns from the guy who's going to keep you out to the guy who is going to give you the guided tour without either of you understanding any significant amount of the other's language. So I got to the inside. I got to see it. This is kind of routine ops in Baghdad. So it's not all fun and games. Sometimes it's fun and games. And that lasted through my whole deployment, but I then got an opportunity to go north and go up into Talil and Tikrit. So, questions on Baghdad. I'm running around, I'm visiting locations. Oh, I have to tell another story, but
no, good.
it involves a barber. But ask your question.
Okay. Well, so I'm curious. 2 things. Because I've got loads of questions, but literally if I ask them all, we will just never get to the end, and at some point I'll have to go to bed. So you very casually said that the lead vehicle in one of your patrols was blown up, and you saw the V-shaped cloud, and you went and extracted him because the vehicle had been immobilized. How often did that happen to you? How often did you come under fire? Did you ever get ambushed?
Yes. It didn't happen much to me in Iraq. It happened a bunch of times in Afghanistan. So when I get to Afghanistan, I'll tell more about those stories.
Okay. All right.
And I have pictures.
Okay. So you're excellent. So the second question then is, you also mentioned on the front of that Humvee there was some electronic warfare gear as an EWO. I'm assuming that you were very interested in that aspect of it. Is that part of your research? Are you looking at the effectiveness of those sorts of systems? I think it's common knowledge that the A6B was, I don't know if this was at the time frame you were there, but the Prowler was doing some work.
Eat shit. Yeah, they sure were. So were the AC or the EC-130s.
Is that part of your remit as well? And can you talk about any of those things?
So it is. All I'll say about that, and I'll talk about some combat tests later. All I'll say about that is it is very difficult to assess the effectiveness of electronic warfare because when it works, you don't necessarily know it because you're not getting feedback from the enemy.
Yeah,
Okay. Where you get feedback is where it doesn't work.
yeah,
So in that stage, by the time I showed up, the solution was turn on all your electronic warfare as soon as you leave the gate and turn it off again when you get back through the gate. Okay. And that worked, except if you were trying to talk on UHF around Baghdad. The Apache guys abandoned the entire UHF radio frequency spectrum that they had in their radios because it was completely jammed out effectively 100% of the time.
really.
Yep.
Okay, very interesting.
Yep.
Did you so as an EWO? I said I'd only ask two, but I've got to ask this follow up question. As an EWO who's been to the school, who understands in minute detail all these things, who has an incredible brain that can wrap his head around these things, did it feel weird to you that you would just flip a switch? You'd leave the because you're in the back of the F4G and you can look at the signals on those displays and you can figure out who the operator is by some of the things they're doing, and you just know this stuff intimately. And then the opposite of that is to press a button when you leave and then press it again when you arrive to turn the system off. So did it feel weird to you to do that?
No. And the reason why is because the approach in Iraq for the crew, the electronic warfare systems, was brute force approach. But if you ever flew with an ALQ 131 Block 2 jamming pod with the receiver processor, which I did out of Spangdahlem, you would turn it on and you would forget about it because that had the computer and the smart jammer and it would handle the jamming better than you could punching control buttons based on what you see on your RWR. So as far as I was concerned, and if you were a buff EWO and you turned on the ALQ 172, it's like, hey, flip it to on and let it do its thing. So, whereas the LQ 155 on the B-52, which was amazing when in terms of power, that was semi-automatic, so that required some manual intervention. So it was completely normal. Turn on the darned electronic warfare when you leave the gate. It's just like a fence check.
Okay, all right.
All right, so I'm gonna show some more slides, and we're gonna go north. And I've got a couple bases that I'm gonna visit to the north, but I'm gonna get there in various helicopters. And the helicopter of choice, which is where I'm taking these photographs, is the Black Hawk. How do I know I'm in a Black Hawk? Because a lot of the time they took the doors off and I'm hanging out seat belted, with my camera, taking these photographs, but also because that's effectively my air conditioning. In a Chinook is the CH-47, this big twin rotor. It's an amazing aircraft. It has no air conditioning. It has no airflow. If your luggage, your life is crap. Okay, the seats are uncomfortable. So no matter how bad an airline flight gets for me in later life, I could fly Ryanair, and it's still better than a Chinook in the summer in Iraq. So if you look at like B-roll, old newsreels, you always see soldiers running off the back of a Chinook. Doesn't matter if they're in combat or they're on their base, they're always running off the back. Why? Because aft of the tail ramp there is an oxygen depleted zone because the engines have sucked all the oxygen out of the air and replaced it with toxic fumes. That's why everybody runs off the back of a Chinook is you're trying to clear the dead zone.
Oh, I did not know that.
Right. So, we're flying up the river and again, you can see there's plenty of green. There's crops, there's plantations. There's also open areas of desert with vehicle tracks because the Iraqis understand the value of roads, but if they don't need them, they don't use them. So you can see all the vehicle tracks through the door gunner's view on the left side. The right side, I don't know what I was taking a picture of, but I clicked the shutter just as one of our self-protection flares. So that's why you have this fuzzy streak across the field of view. And a row of fairly pathetic trees along the side of the road.
Sorry,
Occasionally,
sorry, I just got to interrupt you on that again. So two questions in one. One, you look like you're really high. If your self-dispensing or your automatic countermeasures dispensing units are dispensing flares, they presumably have seen a threat or think they have. So was that an alarming thing to see? And are you very high?
no, I'm less than 1,000 feet. Um, and you can tell by the scale of the trees on the road. So probably closer to 500 than 1,000. And no, because it was just one flare. If it had been a string of flares, it would have been alarming.
Okay.
One flare does, however, get my attention, and I am looking around for smoke trails. There's no doubt about it. But I don't recall it significantly raising my pulse rate. You see some fantastic architecture flying around in helicopters. You know, understand that these are also spotter points for anybody that means you harm. That is essentially a no-go zone for U.S. troops. So this is one of my favorite airborne shots. Um, and you'll notice that even, it's a mosque and the Iraqis themselves are trying to protect it. The gates are closed. There's limited access points. No matter whether it was a Shia or a Sunni house of worship, there was somebody out who was ready to kill you at it.
Hmm.
So as much as I talk about my own experiences, remember, insurgencies are really tough on the population. Okay, so Taji. So Taji is one of the first places I go to because that's where the JTACs are. And it's the old Iraqi repair facility. And so what that means is that anything they couldn't fix, they towed out in the desert and they left it there. Well, now that's not right because we have sergeants major. And remember, sergeants major bothers you if your shoelaces are not properly tied or your uniform is not properly worn or your sleeves aren't rolled up right. So the idea of randomly placed armored vehicles scattered in the desert is offensive to sergeants major. And by the time I got up there, they had spent 3 years meticulously lining up these vehicles in neat rows and making sure that there were no hazardous explosives in them.
Wow.
So it was a massive open air desert museum of military vehicles. Um, Frankly, I wish I had access to it today. Um, and so you got a BMP right there on the right. You've got an Iraqi battle tank on the left. I'm not going to insult my audience because I'm not a tank person by trying to guess what that is, but the spotlight suggests to me it's a T-55 or T-54. And they're just acres and acres and acres of these things. Um, this is the last great act of defiance among all the anti-aircraft artillery. Um, that's scattered out. There is one piece that's elevated. Okay, and so that's why I took this shot, is because that was it. Last act of defiance. So when Spike Benishek and Brian Baxley talk about AAA fire, this is an example of some of the guns that were laying steel up into the air. This is not a small weapon.
What caliber is that?
Um, I have no idea. I'm gonna take a guess and say it's either an 85 or 100.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's big enough for a 130.
Wow. I never realized they were that big.
Yeah, I that's why I included the photo. And here we go. So there's air defense equipment. Now notice that everything has been spray painted. And that's because you're surrounded by the US Army and you can buy spray paint. So those two things guarantee it. So I'm SA2 launcher, of course I'm going to check it out, right? And they've got the launcher and the plate is not in Russian or Arabic. That plate is in English.
Hmm.
Um so there's a fire can, old AAA radar, an SA9 without any missiles on it. I mean, I learn more about the layouts. I'm shocked at how many of these vehicles have pieces and parts that are made of plywood. I always thought they'd be sheet metal. The long track radar, plywood. Um, Totally different ball game. Now, unfortunately, we're not allowed to take war trophies. Fortunately, I walked around with a Leatherman. I'm not saying any more than that. All right, so we'll stop sharing there because I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tikrit and Taji. So I'm actually doing patrols now with the units out there. And one of the units I hooked up with, which is an active duty unit, is the 1st Engineer Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Tyson, um, out of Cobb Spiker, which is the old Iraqi flight training base. Um, and we're close to Saddam's hometown, but it's a great base of operations. The 25th Air Support Operations Squadron is hosting me. A bunch of good guys, and so we're running around. And in this case, we're not doing city patrols. We're on what we call MSR Tampa, which is essentially the Baghdad to Mosul road. And the threat here is mostly command wire, okay? Because what we said we were going to do is with the jammers, we said we're going to force the enemy to go back to the wire, and the enemy said, "Okay." And what the Iraqis would do is command wire for a command detonated bomb or mine is alternator wire. It's that thin red sheen copper stuff, which you don't think is insulated. It's insulated, obviously, because when you look at your alternator, it's a coil. Those wires weren't insulated. They would short out across them. So there's a level of insulation there. They would drive across the desert holding a reel on a stick outside the window, and they might lay out 2,000 meters of command wire as they drive across the desert. One end is at their launch point, one end is near the road, and they are going to leave it there, and they're going to drive away. And at some point in the future, somebody shows up with a battery and the detonator at one end, and somebody else does a quick drive-by and places a mine, and they could do this in 90 seconds. Okay, on the road, hooks it up to the command wire and drives off. So they pre-laid command wire all the time.
Right.
And that's what was killing guys in the north at the time I was going up there, was command wire. And so we needed to find a way to work with command wire.
Is there just from so from a practical point of view, then you talked earlier about the whoever it was, the Apache guys or the fast jet guys or whoever it was, saying there's a heat source on the road ahead of you. If you know they can lay up to 2 kilometers of wire, do you not have Predator overhead on the MSR? With a view that allows them to take in 2 kilometers either side. Is it as simple as that, or is there more to it than that? So you're just looking for a heat source either side.
This wire is like fishing line.
No, but I mean the people. So you don't care about the wire being there, but if someone's going to drive by and attach a mine, and then someone on the other end of it's going to go and install a battery and a detonator, you're looking for the person with the battery and the detonator who's out in the desert 2,000 meters to the side of the MSR. Is it that
we accidentally killed a lot of road repair crews?
Really?
Okay, with drones, on armed drones, because they were doing road repair at night. Why are they doing road repair at night? Because it's fucking cool. That's why. It's not as hot. So it's like, hey, these guys are digging a hole near the road. We need to kill them. Bad call.
Wow.
So it's not that easy. And we were wrong a lot.
Yeah.
So, plenty of guys stop by the side of the road. I mean, a guy stops by this. I've seen crews put ordnance on guys that stopped on a road by the side of the road, and you only realize when they're viewing the video that they're taking a leak. Okay. I've also seen guys go on the video, hey, this dude's taking a leak. And so naturally they zoom in, because that's what you do when you've got an electro-optical system. So yes, it's not that simple.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons I'm there, right? Is because, to try and make those connections. So I'd been out on patrol again and the engineer battalion commander calls me in. He's a lieutenant colonel, I'm a lieutenant colonel, and he says, hey, can you pay a visit? Of course, I'm running around with his guys. Of course I can pay a visit. He says, what can you do from the air to help us out? And I say, maybe we can do a lot of things, but I need you to lay out a test range. And he says, okay. So at the time, I had been out and I had reeled in command wire. And so I'm going to go to my command wire slides before I tell the rest of this story. But I will say one thing about the engineers, is I jokingly asked them, they're showing me their facilities. I said, hey guys, where's your hot tub? And it's like, sir, it burned down. And I thought he was kidding. And then he followed it up with, yeah, and it's a good thing it burned down, because the bribes we were having to pay to keep that thing in water, they were outrageous. So yes, and another reason I love engineers, they had built a hot tub. They're in the middle of the freaking desert. They have the means and they built it. They did not meet Iraqi fire codes or anybody else's fire codes, obviously, but it was a good try. So the engineers had the balls of yarn that in theory cats love.
Hmm.
Okay, so when I was up there, they had a ball of yarn that was at least 2 feet across that was all captured command wire. So let me show a
Wow.
couple slides.
Wow.
All right, so what's wrong with this picture? And it's kind of hard to tell, even though I know what we're looking at. So this is the barbed wire that has been placed over a culvert, which is kind of this trench, as viewed through the bar armor in the window of a buffalo. So there's a bunch of water bottles and there's a bunch of uh, barbed wire, and right here, there's a glint. So I'll zoom in. That's your
Yeah.
glint. That is command wire. 2 strands laid into a culvert in preparation for an emplacement of a bomb underneath the road. The reason this shows up on this camera is because the sun angle is low and we could catch the glint. So the primary detector of these was often the eyeballs, and that's why we like to patrol early in the morning or near sunset, as the sun angles got lower, because it enabled you to see the glint off the command wire. Down south in Basra, the way the Royal Engineers were handling it is the engineers were walking along the sides of the road with a grappling hook and a couple of meters of webbing, and they tied it to their belt. And if they didn't notice the command wire when they walked over it, the grappling hook would often catch it, and a little tug on the back of your belt told you you'd found command wire. That's UK combat engineers at work.
Wow.
We thought that was freaking crazy, but so we've got command wire, and so I said, hey, let's lay out a range. Take your captured command wire and lay it out on a disused corner of Tikrit, and let's see what sensors we can point on it as people are just flying by. And so we laid out the command wire exactly as the Iraqis did. We're using their command wire. And actually, the poor engineers had to do it twice because they laid out the test range, the command wire test range, and this is big. I mean, this is a couple of hectares. And another engineer company that hadn't been clued in rolled along and goes, holy shit, command wire on the base, and they cleaned it all up. So it had to be laid out again. And then I coordinated with a bunch of guys down at the Air Force House in Baghdad, and we put a bunch of taskings in. So anybody with a sensor that flew by or could point their sensor and had collection that wasn't being directed elsewhere, I said, throw your sensors at the command wire test range and see what you can see. And you know what? You can see command wire on a variety of sensors. I suspected this because the navigation radar in the T-43 could make out fence lines around cattle ranches in Nebraska. So I suspected, because all this wire, you see how it's hung up on the brush?
Hmm.
It's not on the ground. It is a number of wavelengths above the ground, and I expected it to act like chaff and re-radiate. And sometimes it does. So this particular project, and the ramifications of this were, we went from the idea of a lieutenant colonel asking me to help in setting out a test range to our first operational success where we detected command wire and were able to give pre-warning to an engineer unit in 90 days at $0 with no development money applied. Just using taskings that were between the gap. I got an ass chewing like you wouldn't believe for pulling this off back in Baghdad.
Really?
Because the Sauron felt that because he was the director of the COIC, that all IED measures had to be coordinated through him, and I had not coordinated through him. And we're in a meeting. I mean, he called the meeting. He says, you have to coordinate through me. And I said, no, I don't. And it's like, you weren't allowed to do this. But I did. He storms out of his own meeting. I mean, it's not like I'm a lieutenant colonel. He could have thrown me out and I'd have walked out with a smile on my face. He storms out of his own meeting. He goes to another Army 06 and demands that I be removed from theater within 24 hours. And it's like the other colonel, Colonel Smith, says, well, I can't do that because he's not in my chain of command. Because remember, there are no Army officers in my chain of command. And besides that, I mean, thrown out of Iraq on 24-hour notice, throw me in that there briar patch. What a story that would have made. So needless to say, I did not get thrown out of Iraq, but that particular Sauron stopped talking to me, which suited me just fine because I didn't need anything from him at this stage. I had developed my own network of contacts, and the Bro network was throwing sensors along critical routes now to look for command wire. Freaking major win.
Did that
Um,
take place systematically then after that? Would sort of MSR recce or whatever you would call it, radar recce or whatever, did that become a thing then, or was it just as and when somebody was coming back from one or going to a mission area that they would
no,
run the radar?
once we proved it was successful, we had already, and again, this is total Bro network. But we had strung all the pieces together. We knew which units were receiving the imagery. We had developed the process to get it priority. We had developed the communications passwords so a guy at Fort whatever could see something on a sensor that had been downlinked to the United States, call up a number, and tell the engineers in that AOR. So that as far as I know, that persisted.
Wow.
Tough to tell because that was done above the brigade level. With institutions that were supporting, so it wasn't reliant on the people who were going to rotate out every 12 months in order to really keep that going.
For the technically curious people, then are you able to go into a bit more detail about that detection? And were there, I mean, you said sensors, and you may want to continue to be vague, but are you talking about fighter radars? Are you talking about sensors on ISR platforms? What can you say more?
What eventually it worked out to is we tasked anybody with a radar. Didn't matter what kind of airplane. If they had a radar, we asked them to look. Um, Thermal sensors were ineffective. That might not be the case today, because we've got much higher resolution today and we can play with the bands. I'd have loved to have a shortwave um, pod like from a AT6 look at that, but those pods did not exist at the time. So I was expecting re-radiation, so we were asking literally anything with a radar, which is why I'm deliberately vague about the whole thing.
Yeah, makes sense.
Um, so I mean, there's those are the big successes um that we were able to get obviously, and I did a bunch of other interesting things. I joined a combat logistics patrol where we went all the way with the 4th Infantry Division, drove all the way from Kuwait, um, and we went all the way to Baghdad. And that squad was led by a staff sergeant from the 4th Infantry Division, a guard portion of it out of Georgia, and an Air Force tech sergeant running the transportation company we were exercising. I was the only officer anywhere near that operation, and I was just there to help. And again, I'm getting training, and it's effectively training and support from their guys because I'm watching their problem. At that time, they had also gotten uh small 8-inch infrared balls to put on the gun trucks. No training to use them. And so I show up at the beginning of this and I can teach them how to use FLIR. And so I'm teaching them advanced techniques. And, the soldiers picked up on this stuff really, really fast. What we learned is you really need a third person to monitor the IR ball. And what we also learned is they mounted a little bit too high because when you hit a highway overpass at 55 miles an hour with your FLIR ball on its mount a little bit too high, it makes a really, really loud noise. Um, but I was there to help with the training, and I was also able to feed back. Um, but at the time I went to Kuwait, this is getting later on in the year, and I've got a couple side trips. I go to Bahrain. because we had a counter IED conference. So it was good to get out of country. I stayed in the most opulent hotel suite ever in Bahrain. It had 3 freaking bathrooms. Everybody's suite had 3 bathrooms, multiple bedrooms. So naturally, because you're just coming out of like Cadillacs with, yes, it's flush toilets. You got that, or in the Al Fawd Palace, but not like this. So everybody I talked to, and this is a point of discussion, every one of us that had come out of Iraq, we felt it necessary to actually use all 3 of the bathrooms. Okay, you couldn't just stick to one. You had to maximize your exposure to quality bathrooms, to say nothing of toilet paper that was not manufactured by the Pink Pony Company. Um, and I had I was now familiar with every fob west of the river, all the way up to Summerall, that had a soft ice cream machine. And I can tell you that Spiker had the best soft ice cream in country, hands down. They also had the Ginsu fruit dude. So whenever they got a shipment of fresh fruit, they lined it up, and they had a guy there. One of the cooks was great with knives, and so you would tell him what you wanted in your fruit bowl, and and the next thing you know, you've got chopped fruit. It was dinner and a show, and soft ice cream, right? So that was definitely my favorite chow hall in the whole freaking country, even better than the embassy. The embassy's soft ice cream machine broke in the fall. But around the fall of 2007, and remember, I've got 2 boys at home, and the Nintendo Wii is relatively new. So we're coming up on the first real Christmas season where it's supposed to be available in numbers, and you cannot freaking find a Nintendo Wii in a store. And I had dissuaded them from buying a Nintendo Wii with money they'd saved up, because they were going to buy a used one. That's all they could afford. And a used Nintendo Wii in the first year was going to be because it was broken. Um, so now the price has accelerated above their ability to get the cash, even if they could find one. And so I am on the great Nintendo Wii hunt. So I go through Baghdad. I cannot find a Nintendo Wii. We later found out Sue Tracy and I busted the black market ring accidentally that was trading Nintendo Wiis in Baghdad. Um, then I went to Bahrain, no Wiis. I'm driving over Kuwait, waiting for the convoy to start, trying to find a freaking Nintendo Wii, no Wiis. Okay, I am out of ideas, and I'm on this combat logistics patrol. We're headed north. We stop at this fortified freaking truck stop. And I go to the shopette to restock the Mountain Dew, because remember, I'm the bartender. And in a pallet in the shopette at this fortified truck stop is an entire pallet full of Nintendo Wiis. And it's like, holy shit. So I rush back to the tent, because I was combat configured, and I don't normally have a credit card in my uniform when I'm outside the wire. Same like when I'm flying, right? Because if you're captured, you don't want the guys that captured you running shit up on your credit card. Okay, so don't go into combat with a credit card. It is just one more thing for you to worry about. You're already having a bad day. So I run back, and I'm running because I don't want this entire pallet of Nintendo Wiis to disappear in the next 6 to 9 minutes till I get my freaking credit card. So I go and I buy the Nintendo Wii, and I'm a hero now. I'm in the middle of Iraq, somewhere south of Talil, at a fortified truck stop where I can't even remember the name. We place it in the middle of the gun truck, surrounded by discarded body armor. So actually, the best protected thing in the whole freaking truck is this Wii. And I mean, and so I make it north and drive to Baghdad, mail this home. I'm a freaking hero. And I'm traveling with really a platoon I really enjoyed. And they were getting really comfortable with me. And we had another stop where somebody at the transportation command had tried to promulgate a change in the rules of engagement. So for tactical reasons, we drove everywhere we could at 55 miles an hour. We closed both roads, both directions, while we refueled, because you can't it's a multi-day trip, and you can't drive all day without refueling. So we'd stop, we'd refuel out of jerry cans, and then we'd move on. And when we did that, we'd stop all traffic so nobody could approach us while we were refueling. That pissed a lot of people off. But the squad I'm with is now really comfortable. I've helped them with the IR sensors. I've cleaned up their radio. They all talked like truckers on Citizens Band radios from Smokey and the Bandit. And so I gave them a quick training course. This is how you talk. This is how you do check-ins. So it's like the Brevity Code Star Wars episode. It's right. You check in order. You don't do this random check-in stuff. So I brought some comm discipline to the Air Force guys doing transport, the guys doing security. They were happy to have me. So here we are. I'm on one stop, and there's an attempt to change the rules of engagement. And it was just this random rambling, like some captain had taken down the rambling, irate rambling of a colonel or a general officer and said, you need to do this, but there were actually no instructions. But the instructions that on what to change, no change in the rules of engagement, no change in the speed, and this is a point they were, the leadership of this was just doing stupid shit. And so they said, and you have to have this brief to you, and you have to sign it off with a battalion commander equivalent. We're gonna freaking stop. There's no O5s anywhere near me. There's probably no O5s within 200 miles unless one happens to be flying overhead in an Air Force or Navy asset. So I am suddenly a battalion commander equivalent. And I listened to all these gobbledygook, and I applied what I learned in company commander school, which is ask the questions of your NCOs. Keeping in mind, I did not go to company commander school. Okay. So I'm surrounded by NCOs. And it's like, okay, guys, what do you think? It says, well, sir, this is going to really decrease our survivability. I said, there are no instructions in here. So here it is. Take my name down. Here are your orders. There are no changes to your rules of engagement or your tactical patterns. None have been issued. Okay. This is not a document that allows you to do anything. Do it exactly the way you're doing. And anybody who wants to dispute it, you have them call me. That was my 69 seconds as a battalion commander equivalent. And all I needed to do was have a little bit of freaking common sense. But, I'd also been driving around with these guys. And yes, I had their back. They also had my back. So here we are at a stop. And I've got an irate Blackwater guy, okay, who is escorting a convoy. And Blackwater, they were a disaster. Basically losing the war in Iraq, one unnecessary civilian casualty at a time. Every time I met them, they were cowboys and clowns. But this is one of my early encounters, and I've got this guy who's freaking yelling at me about why I've stopped traffic. And of course, the sergeants, now they've got this irate Blackwater guy, which normally they would have to deal with. They're not dumb. They have an O5 in the convoy. This is now my problem. So I'm talking to this guy, and he's getting heated, and then I hear this little tink, 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 tink behind me. That sound is the ball bearings on the turret, on the gun truck behind me with its 50 caliber rotating to point a 50 cal over my right shoulder. I don't even need to turn around. I know who the gunner is, and I know what the gunner's doing. And I noticed this through the immediate change of demeanor on the part of my overarmed, out of control, irate Blackwater dude, because he is no longer having a discussion with this random lieutenant colonel on the street. He is having a discussion with the random lieutenant colonel on the street, suddenly backed by a 50 caliber machine gun. Okay. At which point the discussion pretty much goes to, yeah, okay, we'll wait until you're done. And I didn't get heated. I didn't get irate. I didn't yell at the guy. I didn't swear at him. I was just explaining him the way it was. And then tink, 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 tink. And it was like as if I'd said, and that's the way it's going to be. So soldiers did all that. They did that for me. And I think the gunner, that might have been Wind Talker. Wind Talker had been a guard guy now, but he'd been a Marine Corps Lance Corporal during Desert Storm. So he was at NCO now. And he may have been the guy at the guns, but I can't remember. And he was like me. He could tell endless stories. And I knew he was getting super comfortable, but there's certain things you cannot ignore as an officer. And so we're having a discussion in the barracks, and there was a question whether or not we were going to pull guard duty or whether the local guys manning the fort were going to pull the guard duty. Turns out the local defense was going to pull the guard duty, but the question was, how was going to schedule it? And it's like, well, somebody's going to have to do double shifts. And it's like, well, I can do guard duty. It's like, well, lieutenant colonels don't do guard duty. This lieutenant colonel does guard duty. So it was more likely than not I was going to be paired up with Wind Talker because we'd keep each other awake and we would never shut up. that didn't have to happen. We got to sleep in, but Windtalker is still talking, and the subject gets on to Star Trek porn. Now remember, General Order 1, which bans alcohol, also bans porn. So, and while I, am not there to be the Inspector General, there are certain things that I can't let slide. So as Windtalker gets going, he goes, "There's this website." I go, "Windtalker?" He goes, "Yes, sir." "Don't say anything I have to pay attention to." Yes, sir. And then he goes, "So I've heard that there's this porn site on Star Trek porn." And the conversation goes off just fine. Everybody has been appropriately warned, and we have an understanding. Don't say anything I have to pay attention to. So that was a good trip. That was enjoyable. I ended up with a Nintendo Wii, and I got off at Baghdad, but the guys asked me if I wanted to go farther north, and I would have if I'd had the time. But I couldn't afford a delay because I was going to head. I had to go back to the States to brief on what I was learning. So I got to go back just before Christmas, and I was scheduled for a brief. But the fact is that the Air Force guys I was briefing, they lost control of their own schedule. They took a bullshit standard normal scheduled brief. They gave me 5 minutes. They got no information from me, and they couldn't care enough to rework their schedule to get a brief directly from theater. And I didn't stay for Christmas, even though I was going back in December, because I didn't want, it was not fair for me to go home and stay for Christmas when all those guys out in the desert couldn't go home for Christmas. So I
Hmm.
made sure I was back in Baghdad for Christmas, which gets to another story and more slides. So now we're into the storytelling part. We're kind of done tactically with Iraq. There's a bunch of things I just have to lay out. So ask a question. What the heck?
So what were your findings then at this point? So you have obviously talked about the command wire. You've talked about the ability to detect that. What other things were would you, if you'd been given 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it was at that briefing, what would you have been saying?
Oh, so I got that time. I outbriefed extensively. It was a brief that was initially called All Over the Chart. And it was briefed up to the 4-star level. When General Mattis, as GIFCOM commander, visited the Irregular Warfare Center of Excellence at Nellis, I was deployed, of course. He showed up holding um, a copy of my brief.
Did he?
So I outbriefed extensively, and I talked about tactical issues and threat issues and counterinsurgency doctrine issues, and the structure of the air component and how we responded and command and control air power in response to Army needs. Most of those recommendations were taken in good stead. The Air Force was not willing, particularly within CENTAF, they were not willing to reconsider their command and control architecture because they viewed Iraq as a temporary condition and they didn't want to have to reorient later, which I completely disagreed with then and now, but not my call.
Hmm.
So, yes, all this went into a fairly extensive, unclassified um, brief with a classified annex that pointed out a couple things. It talked about combat test, and how we did it, why we did it, how we coordinated it. I mean, it laid out largely what I've told you in clinical detail on PowerPoint slides because we're the Air Force and that's how we communicate information. With pictures.
Okay.
Um, okay, so rockets. And I mentioned on a previous account that my bicycle, which is right there behind me, oops, let's go in the opposite direction. My bicycle had been temporarily taken offline by a 240 millimeter rocket. Okay, but those were rare. The normal ones were 107 millimeter rockets. And I did not know that 107 millimeter was a caliber. But by the time I left Baghdad, I could identify a 107 millimeter rocket in all phases of flight from launch to explosion. So, I had a couple rocket events, right? So, Thanksgiving, where I go to the chow hall for Thanksgiving, we get turkey, but you know what else they had? Shrimp. I love shrimp. Okay. But I particularly then, I did not like to eat by myself at a table. Okay. And I was often soloing it because I had this weird fixation that everybody's watching me eat. Nobody's watching me eat. Nobody gives a shit what I'm eating, how I'm eating, but it's just a thing. So I like to grab my food and I go back to my trailer and I can eat however I want. If I want to inhale shrimp through both nostrils, I can do it and nobody will know it. So, not that I would do that because that's disgusting and it would ruin a good shrimp. Um, And so I'm walking home with my shrimp, and the freaking alarm goes off. Like incoming, incoming. It's like, damn it, it's an automated alarm. There are rounds incoming. And I look around and there's no freaking good cover. I can run next to the generators. Okay, that's not good cover. Never take cover beside something filled with flammable liquid. Okay, made that rule right there. Hadn't given it any thought before or since, but don't do that. So here I am crouched behind a Jersey barrier, like your highway barrier. That's the only thing I got, giving me like 40% coverage. I'm hunched over my shrimp so that if a rocket lands nearby, it doesn't get dirt into my shrimp. Okay, because I don't want the shrimp to be ruined. So these are like, again, like the Wii, it's the best protected shrimp in Iraq. But then there's another event where I'm out riding, and as obvious from the photo. And for those of you who are not seeing this, when 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 Steve disparagingly says I'm wearing spandex, I'm wearing high quality, form fitting cycling clothes. Okay, and I look like a freaking stud. Okay, and the bonus on cycling shorts is that they're padded. Okay, which is not only protective but great advertising. Um, so I'm riding. I ride all the time. I don't like to run, so I ride, and I'm out there with my Camelback and 45 rounds of ammunition and a first aid kit and whatever else I think I need to go around with. Plenty of water. I'm wearing my helmet, of course, because I got my bicycling helmet. And the rocket alarm goes off, and then I hear, boom, boom, and it's like, damn it! I'm on a causeway between ponds in Baghdad. And so there is no cover. So I just start racing to try and get across a bridge so I can go underneath the bridge and into cover. This is the bridge of justice. And so from where I'm standing, actually, and taking this photo much later, this is where the first rocket hits, which is right next to the British building, but it lands in the water. So as I'm riding frantically towards this bridge from the right, I have no idea how fast I'm going, but I'll bet you I was pretty freaking quick. I hear the rocket coming in, and I think, oh, this is gonna be close. And boom, it is close, but it hits the water. The water absorbs all the frag. So by the time the second round comes in, I've crossed the bridge, I have dismounted, and I'm under the bridge to the left, across the canal where those cables are going, with another local worker, probably an import, and we're sheltering from the next 8 rounds that come in. I later plotted them all. I am in an exact geographic middle of the 9 rocket stunk, which is probably the safest place to be because they're not that accurate. 2 of them didn't even go off. The only injury was a working dog who got his ear clipped by a fragment. But every time a rocket lands, this guy is swearing in English. And it's just one string of foul profanity after another, and I'm laughing my ass off. So to make things worse, here's this guy crouched under a bridge in fear of his life, wondering why he ever took this freaking job, and there's an American under the bridge laughing with him, laughing his ass off. So that's the rocket events. Christmas. People sent me stuff. I'm back for Christmas. And so naturally, I get Christmas antlers. This is almost certainly from my mom. And so naturally, I put them on my bicycle helmet, and I'm wearing them all over the place. You'll notice I'm wearing a jacket, so it's a little bit colder in Baghdad. And I have numbers of things to distribute. So I'm distributing movies, food, cookies, giant containers of cheese balls. They all come to my office, and I distribute them out. And I don't take them mostly to the headquarters. I take them out to the unit ready rooms. So I take them to the engineers. Most of the movies went to the armorers who get me an M16, put some fancy stuff on it. We traded a couple techniques for clearing malfunctions, some of which they didn't know, some of which I didn't know. And I gave them some of the combat video for entertainment. So, and they were the guys I just said, hey, you get all the videos that are sent to me, and you can distribute them, throughout the infantry. And so that's how I was Santa Claus. So I like being Santa Claus. And speaking of Santa Claus, I remember I told you I'd get back to the Leafblower.
Yes.
This is why I love the National Guard. So this is before morning on a Christmas morning patrol. which is actually the only patrol I was on in Iraq in which we actually found and destroyed an explosive. Okay, so I got to hit the little clacker on 2 pounds of C4. Unfortunately, the lieutenant had closed the armored door on the det cord and it didn't go off, so we had to send the robot out again with 2 more pounds of C4, which made that much bigger a bang the second time around. But I mean, even the gunner had a Christmas hat, on top of his helmet. So the only thing over the gun turret level was this little Christmas hat. They'd bought a bunch of presents and wrapped them, and all the kids that waved at them, the engineers were distributing Christmas presents on Christmas morning as they did their patrol route through Baghdad. They had
Nice.
everything planned, and they saved some back so the kids at the end of the route would also get some. And so the Leafblower, this is a National Guard edition. When you pulled up to a box on the road or by the side of the road, you needed to send up the buffalo, and the buffalo's robotic arm has a spork on the end. It's 3 tines with a back tine. And they would poke the box. And if the box did not explode, they would then kind of dismantle the box with the arm, and then we would move on. But that takes time every time. So one of the guard guys said, I'll put a gasoline-powered leaf blower on the front of the vehicle. And so this leaf blower had a rod that went through the frontal armor so that the driver could change it from blowing left to blowing right. And it would blow a stream of high-pressure air at the box. And if the box was empty, it blew away. And if it did not blow away, you backed off and brought up the buffalo. Probably cut stopped times by well over 50%. That's a National Guard combat engineering unit at work.
Nice.
Leaf blower.
Yeah, that's clever.
Yeah, super clever. And that's just one of the palaces at night with a helicopter over the top. Because I happened to be cycling and it looked like it was going to be a cool shot, and darn it, yes, it was. So that wraps me up for Iraq. I think I've got in the stories I wanted to get, and here we are. And so just to change the complete flavor, Afghanistan is not Iraq. And so one of the things with Afghanistan is what we call the jingle trucks. That's a jingle truck. That's in the Konar River Valley, and it's an Americanization of Jenga trucks. Truck drivers decorate their trucks. It's their whole livelihood. And they have reflective stuff hanging from the windows and mirrors all over them, which means, by the way, that they actually give you flashes all the time as if somebody's looking at you with binoculars.
Oh.
So I've checked out bicycles because we'd dismount and check out a bicycle because we got a flash from a tree line. It was just a guy taking a break during Ramadan. So Afghanistan, different environment. This is a kalat. All villages in the hinterlands where I was looked like this. They are fortified compounds with high walls. There's a lot of stuff growing inside the compounds and outside the compounds. The terrain is fairly steep. There are some parts of Afghanistan that, if it were not for goats, could not be inhabited. I mean, this is barren. There are also parts of Afghanistan in which the hills are green. It's not green because there's green stuff growing. It's green because there are surface copper deposits. There are lapis mines that have been mined consistently and continuously since Alexander the Great conquered the country 300 BC. And so here I am, and I'm back in the game. And in the right, I'm in the Kurisofi Valley up at altitude. On the one patrol where I wore the new tiger stripes and decided that was never going to happen again. Too heavy, too hot, too pointless, and not fireproof. Okay, so I'm back in my normal combat configuration, which is flight suit, body armor, ammo, weapons, and all the assorted accoutrements, but no hand grenades. That's the V5 version of the RG-31, blasting across the desert. That's what we did a lot of work with. This is a Husky with ground-penetrating radar. So I did one long patrol out to the border in Pakistan, in the southeast corner, Paktika province, and this obstacle took us all day to get through because there are maybe brown lines on the map. That doesn't mean it's a road. This is near an abandoned village where it is essentially a hazard where the dust has gathered. It is so thick that we cannot get through it with trucks. We had to put trucks that went into this, we had to pull out with cables. So We had an earth mover. We dismounted an earth mover that we were transporting from its flatbed. We kind of dug out this trench, and now we've got the ground penetrating radar checking it over.
Is the ground penetrating radar that entire assembly at the front?
Yep.
That's not a scoop or something.
Nope.
That whole thing's a radar.
Yep.
How far down could it see?
Depends on the type of soil and the moisture content. But generally, in this case, farther than anybody's willing to dig.
Okay.
Um,
So what it would for the operator, it would just beep when it saw something, or you'd actually see a picture in the
oh,
the
you
camera.
got both. You got a
Okay.
warning, and you had to be freaking fast, but it also slowed your speed of advance down quite a bit.
Okay.
So again, this is what combat logistics patrol looks like. You're strung out. You're going between hills, valleys, villages. You see the point vehicle has a remote weapon station. Obviously, I'm dismounted ahead of this lot, because I'm taking this photograph. From an elevated position. Our flatbeds to move damaged vehicles. You bring along empty flatbeds for that. We've got our Hemet transporters. The inset on the lower left shows two Huskies out in front, an RG-35 off the road, and a Buffalo with its cage armor. Combat engineers. This this was a fun event, 10 days long, and we had the company commander with us, so that was very handy. Learned a lot on this particular trip, and we encountered 7 IEDs. We found 3 of them. The other 4 we encountered the hard way. Found them the hard way. We were mortared. We were ambushed. This is all normal operations. This is, again, now I'm wearing the bandana because the dust issue was horrible.
Hmm.
So I had fortunately brought along a couple of camouflage bandanas, and I was using them constantly as dust masks. So again, I'm flight suited up, aviator shades, because you had to wear iPro, but because the aviator shades are designed to resist birds, they'll do at least as well as the Army Ice iPro, and they don't fog, and they're prescription.
Yeah.
So I have advantages here. Here, actually, the company commander's on the left. We'll just call him Captain John. And we are doing a search operation for a downed UAV in a Afghan village. And this is, who thought of this idea? The UAV goes down. It's freaking disposable, right? But no, they divert an entire combat logistics patrol that happens to be there and say, go search this. Well, all the walls look like this. We can't look over them. Our platoon leader, who is a bit of a lunatic, ends up shooting off a lock so he can look behind one of the walls, and all that's there is melons. The Afghan National Police show up, and you cannot trust the ANP. So, in contrast to the Iraqis, when the ANP shows up in their green pickup trucks, the entire threat axis of the platoon changes. So everybody shifts their rifles to not quite point at the police. Okay, and now that's the primary threat as opposed to whatever happens to be in this collage. So this is one of the village headmen that's trying to help us find his stuff. The guys that actually found the UAV were the transportation guys in the back of the convoy who rolled up, grabbed a kid, paid him $20, and he told him where the thing was. Yeah, we this was not the most shining moment. But there we were walking around in culottes. And fortunately everybody had their safeties on. Because there were people who just come out of the buildings and startle you. Note that there's not a lot of glass here.
Yeah.
This is Buffalo with the robotic arm sporking. So the explosives would often be under the middle of the road for maximum kill value, but the pressure plate's under the tire tracks. So what this guy's doing is dragging a spork to break the wires between, and then the explosive ordnance guys will go and set off the explosion. These are actually 2 separate events, as you can tell by the timestamps. But that's a Buffalo dragging a spork. Again, up on a hill from a distance. This is zoomed in. And you would often see the explosive ordnance disposal guys come out and then pick things up. They'd look it over and they'd pick it up. And you've got an entire vehicle full of combat engineers and me going, when we see a guy reach forward and pick up something that we detected as a bomb, and he walks back to his truck with it and throws it in the back. So that's normal operations. But as we're going down, the reason we're going down to Waziqwa, which is the last fob up before the Pakistani border, is because we're helping the Polish brigade rotate out. So, I mean, this is freaking awesome. I get into the farthest fob, and they have Polish food there, and I'm digging it. I have to say that not everybody is digging it with me. I think I was with the Missouri Guard on this particular trip, and they were not digging the Polish food, but I was. So that was great, and these guys are packed up. Now, this is a Rosamac, which is their armored personnel carrier with its gun turret, and we are stationary and not under threat. How do I know that? Because the driver's taking a nap. So when something's going on in a convoy, the guys that can hear are the gunners and who are up top and the drivers, okay, on the armored vehicles. And so when you see the Polish gunners slam their hatches closed, and the driver disappear and close his hatch, they think something's about to go down and it's time to pay attention. The other thing about the Poles is no matter where they are, they will set up a volleyball net. They will play volleyball in sand and dust that is knee deep. But on the back of some of these vehicles is their volleyball net.
Wow.
Unroll it, set it up, stake it down, and they'll play a game of volleyball before anybody is even finished unpacking and warming up dinner, which could be an MRE. What does an IED look like? That's what an IED looks like. So on this particular trip, I think this is the one I spotted first. And I spotted it first because the platoon leader had a bad feeling, and we were driving off the road. And I actually saw this looking out the back. We had already passed it. And what I'm looking at is a circle of disturbed earth right here in the middle, if you can see the mouse. This water bottle is here because I've thrown the water bottle to kind of mark the IED so everybody else's eyes can get on it. If it were at night, I'd have put a glow stick in the water bottle. Otherwise, you throw a glow stick and it disappears in the dust. Now, I've noticed, I pointed out my throwing skills. It's nowhere freaking near the IED, but at least it's close enough to give me a reference point. You see the water bottle? Yeah. Not there.
It's pointing at it, though.
It is pointing at it, yes. So that is an emplaced IED. And what I'm actually seeing where I pointed the circle in the wheel rut is the pressure plate. The explosive is harder to detect. It's under this disturbed earth right here.
Where's the pressure plate?
The pressure plate is this in
it's that
water
there.
bottle. You just follow the water bottle along the wheel rut. That's the pressure plate.
Okay.
The explosive device is this mound right here. I saw the disturbance over the pressure plate.
Wow. So where were you when you saw that?
I was inside the back of an RG-31 looking out the back windows calling stop.
So you had driven over it?
We had driven past it because we were off to the side because the platoon leader felt this was a good place for an ambush.
Wow.
So we were the lead vehicle. We had the platoon leader, the company commander, the medic, and me in the lead vehicle, which upon reflection may not have been our best move, but I had never actually thought about that until now. And this is, again, we're setting off. Notice how much dust gets kicked up by this explosion. And it's hard to time your shutter for an explosion because it's not like they give a countdown, but it's not that close. The ground penetrating radar and the Buffalo are off, and those pickup trucks on the hills, those are the guys we're pointing the 50 cals at. That's the Afghan National Police. You will note they are not on the road.
Yeah.
Okay, odds are good they're in the pay of the local insurgents anyway. That's another look at the Husky with a ground penetrating radar. It's currently in the retracted position. And that's the way back. So on the way back, the adversary is not stupid. So you can't tell from this photo, but this is in a series of S turns. So they had watched us use the ground penetrating radar on the way back, on the way down, and on the way back, they realized that they could place an explosive device such that because the vehicle was in a turn, the radar would not cover. This was an S turn among a bunch of wells. So you had to make it. And that's where they planted the IED. And so this is the one that exploded. You can see the crater underneath the vehicle.
Yeah.
That's where the smoke split in a V, and that's where we pulled up next to the guy and extracted it because the hatch is on the top. Extracted the driver out of the top of the hatch. Wow. And then while we're waiting around to get this thing loaded up on a truck so we can move it because it's immobile, the Rosamac, the Polish APC, takes up a overwatch position on a hill and hits an anti-tank mine. the enemy had completely plotted out exactly what we were going to do in this case. And so I'm dismounted looking up and I hear this bang and I look there and I see a cloud of dust and the entire wheel assembly from a Polish armored vehicle 100 meters in the air and flying perpendicular to my position. So again, we hop in the RG-35 and we go up to the Rosamac because, like I said, we've got the medic and the RG-31. The RG-31 has hatches on the top two as well as the back and the front. So I pop out and we say, "Hey, do you need a medic?" And the Polish soldier inside goes, "Fuck that," or he says, "Fuck medic. We don't need medic. We're in Rosamac." So there was a slight tear in the hull, and these guys were as far as they were telling us, uninjured. So we towed that sucker back to base, and that's where it was, the following evening before sunset.
Wow.
And I don't want to say that you don't see cool stuff in Afghanistan. This is Khyber Khat. This is an ex-British Army post. Khyber Khat Castle, it's often called, and it is allegedly haunted by all the prisoners that were tortured to death here by the Brits and the Soviets. Okay, it was an Afghan National Army post with a small special forces detachment. We spent a couple nights in here. That's pretty much. There's no electric lights, and you try not to show lights after dark because you don't want to catch mortar rounds because you're showing lights. So there I am sleeping under one of those flatbeds on a cot. In case mortar fire comes in, at least I'm under a flatbed.
Did you see any evidence of it being haunted? Any ghosts?
No, but I was tired and I slept heavily. On the right, this is Fob Blessing in the Korengal River Valley, which was a separate trip at the time. The Konar River Valley. This was one of the most heavily fought over areas at the time I was there. Just a month before I think I got there, a French paratroops had gotten into a long, extended firefight and taken a lot of casualties. I'd have liked to embed with the French, but I didn't have the French language skills to do it. There's no point in, having a guy who doesn't speak your language when it all goes to pieces because they're not going to talk in English for me and I can't advise them in French. So I'd love to hook up with the French paratroops, but I just didn't have the language skills. So this is Fob Blessing, and this is a point in their deployment where they are not going outside the wire, other than to set up observation posts. I got in and out of there by helicopter. They had a battery of 155 millimeter howitzers, and they were doing all of their reconnaissance and interdiction with fire. Because they'd been there for 12 months. They had 3 more months to go, and the battalion commander, it wasn't even an infantry unit. It was what they called part of a maneuver enhancement brigade, which is where you take a bunch of support guys and make them pretend they're infantrymen and stick them out in the field. Bad idea, but they were at a point, and I can't blame them. They were at a point in their patrol history where they were hunkered down because the battalion commander was not prepared to lose more guys to no purpose that he could detect.
Yeah.
And I show this to show you how steep the mountains are, and how lovely the terrain is. And that's a better look at exactly the same area. There's some kind of water buffalo thing in the foreground. Could be an extra large dog. We've got a Kiowa scout helicopter temporarily there. And that's where the helicopters came in and came out. We were doing emergency resupply of artillery shells all the time. That's how I got in and out. It was basically hopping on board resupply. All right,
so that just from those mountains, then did you get shot at from those? Would the Taliban or whoever it was, would they have been up there in those mountains shooting down onto the camp?
No, because there was no point in it. There was no reason to go shoot the Americans because you would have had to tote your AK-47, your RPG up in the mountains. And why bother? The Americans were completely ineffective. It's not like we were affecting Taliban operations in the area. We were just shelling people and pissing them off. Yeah. So the only people up there were our guys with observation points. So again, I'm running around Afghanistan and I'm doing a bunch of stuff. I mostly was up in Paktika province. Did an overnight to Kandahar because I was escorting General Holmes, who was once again endangering his career by being my boss. He was also sink skunk, so this was not the last time I would endanger his career. But he was the wing commander at Bagram, and I spent a day as part of his protective detail, like the day I arrived, walking through a hospital with a rifle, which is frowned upon, but too bad. That he turned at Bob Salerno, you know, um, hooking up with various units both out of Bagram and flying out of Kandahar up into the river valley and the long combat logistics patrol, whatever locally was going around. I do want to do a call out for Private First Class Ford. So, one of the things that this is where you get the troops comfortable with you. One of the things um that I did is I had a very specific use of tracers in my magazines. So for my ready magazine, the first 2 rounds are always tracers. And the reason behind that is because a guy in a car might not be able to hear a warning shot. But if you zip a tracer across his field of view, it's a different ball game. Um, so I was in Afghanistan. I was able to effectively use the laser on my rifle as a warning, so I never needed to fire a warning shot. I did cue in the laser, flash it across somebody's windscreen. They get the idea in a hurry.
Mm.
So that was usually when we were, dealing with a disabled vehicle for one reason or another, and other trucks are coming along, sweep the laser across the windscreen. They get the clue. Um, my marking magazine every second round is a tracer in case I need to mark a position for aerial support. So I need tracers, and I have them. I don't even know if this is a smart technique, but like my 11th and 12th rounds remaining were tracers. So if I fire 2 tracers in a row in a normal magazine, I know I've got 10 rounds left after that second tracer. So, but the Air Force didn't have any issues. So in Afghanistan, Private First Class Ford, who was the saw gunner, M249, hears about my problem and he comes to help me out. He helped me out on everything. Okay, and he strips out a 100-round belt and gives me all the tracers. And so I've got that's great. I really appreciate it. And he says, "Hey, I've got armor piercing too. You want armor piercing?" And I cannot actually think of a use in my magazine loadout for armor piercing rounds. It's like, no, thank you, Private. It was nice of you to ask, but I can't think of a use I would have for armor piercing rounds. It is enough for me that you have armor piercing rounds. And he accepted that. But one of the things I don't like to not have ice in my drinks. This is a problem in Afghanistan. It's a problem in Iraq too, but it's definitely a problem in Afghanistan. So we're on this long patrol, and I'm in the middle of freaking nowhere. But the base has an ice machine. It's freaking awesome. That's the good news. The bad news is it's non-potable water. It's the stuff you're taking showers in, which you're not supposed to drink. So I can't put ice in my drinks. Private First Class Ford grabs a 100-round magazine, strips the belt out of it, punches a couple holes, makes a carrying strap out of parachute cord, and next thing I have is I've got a water holding container that I can wrap ice around a water bottle and walk around the fob like a doofus, but a doofus with cold water. So, so that's kind of where we are in Afghanistan. And again, I come back, and this time before I went, actually, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command had given me a bunch of questions to ask, and things they wanted me to look at because after they saw the first report, so I had a list, I had objectives, I had things they wanted me to look at, so I gave feedback to them, and I come out with a second report that hits multiple service 4-star levels, and that's called "Here Be Dragons."
You didn't call
Um,
it that.
Pardon?
You called it that.
I called it that because I was essentially off the map. I mean, even when I've got the maps loaded on my GPS, it's a freaking brown line. It's mostly imaginary. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
surrounded by nothing. There are no features on these maps. Nothing I can use to navigate. So I'm fairly well equipped. But you're in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan. So that briefing went well. And I tried to get up. I had noticed that the Army was sending they've got a program called FAST, Field Assistance Science and Technology, where they send scientists and engineers forward to FOBs. With that ground penetrating radar, every base we stopped at, we had a helicopter show up with 3 engineers from, I think, Georgia Tech Research Institute, guys in their 20s who would follow us fob to fob on the helicopter and debrief the guys after every mission. What worked, what didn't work, how was the warning, why did you get blown up? Um, so we never had Air Force. But I ended up being the sole Air Force scientific and technical guy in country, and that's because I gave myself the job. and tried to make connections. And I tried afterwards to set up what I called the combat scientist problem, where the Air Force would send our scientists and engineers just like the Army does to major bases, and it didn't happen.
Why?
Because the colonels at AFCENT didn't feel it was a valuable a use of valuable resources. They didn't want to do it. They didn't see the value. They were, perfect in every way, and so there was no need to bring technical guys forward for education or for any other reason. I'm still pissed about it. Obviously, another opportunity flushed down the toilet by people who were making judgments about in the theater, but about countries they had never been in, and operations they had never seen. So it kind of set up a conflict. And one of the things I was doing in both Iraq and Afghanistan is I asked people about light attack. So the light attack idea had already germinated because in 2007, I was taking that picture in Colombia, seeing the Super Tucano and with precision weapons and the sensor ball. And this was what we'd been looking for, Toro and Meat and I, when we conceived a modern A1 Sky Raider equivalent for the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And once soldiers had it explained to them, they said, yeah, that would be nice, particularly if we could put these out at forward operating bases. So we did briefings. We were trying to make the point. We showed how you could distribute it. We showed how you could cut down fighter reaction time. And we thought we were getting interest. So I'll go to my last slides. And I actually made a huge mistake. Is that I was offered when the MC-12s got spun up, I was offered the OPSO position to go out, and I made the mistake of thinking it was more important for me to stay on the staff and push light attack because it looked like we were going to get over the hump. I was wrong, and it's always a mistake to turn down an operational deployment, and that's a time I made it. It's the only operational deployment opportunity I ever turned down, and I regret it to this day. So
Expound on that. Why?
I thought that we were about to get light attack in the United States Air Force. And I thought that I was important enough in the process as the primary push that if I went to Afghanistan or Iraq for 3 months, we would lose the momentum. I misjudged the momentum. I definitely should have gone out with the MC-12s. Staff officer mistake.
What do you think? So you've talked previously about being the most combat deployed aviator in your squadron for 6 years, I think, or in the fighter community, or
no, over a 6 year period.
It was so over 6 years. So you never shied away from that. But what would you have got from 3 months as OPSO of an MC-12 unit?
Operations.
Okay.
That's what I'd have gotten. I'd have gotten another opportunity to run to the sound of the guns. That is more valuable a career opportunity than anything I would ever be offered. That's why I went to Iraq and Afghanistan, because the general officers who gave me the opportunity knew that there is nothing more important to me than the opportunity to run to the sound of the guns.
Okay, but you're a thinker though, so
yeah, and I think I'm a lunatic.
No, but I don't know. I'm sort of I'm just second guessing you really. I'm just thinking. To me, it would make sense. So MC-12 has been stood up. They're going to go and do their thing. 3 months doing that, or you stay with something that could truly be sort of material in the way, changing the way that the Air Force does business. And I could understand why you would say that I'll do that. That's
yes, and that was my logic, and I recognized the logic at the time. What you and I are both failing to consider is that the Air Force doesn't move that fast, and I'm a cog in the machine. So whatever happened on the MC-12 side in those 3 months, or on the OAX side in those 3 months, I was going to be irrelevant to it.
Yeah.
Okay, but it didn't look that way from my vantage point. Yeah. So the MC-12s went on just happily without me, and the Air Force went on ignoring OAX just happily with me.
Okay.
But I was back, and so this photo's in 2010. So I went back as for an air power assessment, and this is the ground crew, Afghan ground crew, on an MH17. I just come down from a flight. Somebody wanted a picture, so we took the picture, and I made sure that each of these guys got a printout copy of this picture for themselves because they weren't going to have, cameras or iPhones.
Hmm.
Um, this was the ground crew. And so I was hugely impressed by this helicopter. We went up with Afghan pilots, the advisor American pilots, a door gunner, and me. They had this helicopter at 13,300 feet, and I'm still looking up at the mountaintops. Not only is that amazing for a helicopter, because 700 more feet and we'd have been required to be on oxygen.
Yeah.
Um, and that just tells you something about Afghanistan. So I went back to do an air power assessment. So I wrote the tactical portion of the 2010 air power assessment that resulted in the plan that General Moseley signed off on to acquire light attack and armed helicopters for the Afghan National Army Air Corps at the time, eventually the Afghan Air Force. So that was actually my plan they executed. And in the process, I torpedoed the idea of giving them L-159s.
Okay.
Because they weren't going to be able to handle them just yet. I trolled the idea of upgraded L-39Cs or later models. The Afghans weren't interested in them. So anyway, they ended up with some combat power, but this is my one relevant photo from that, which again gave me good exposure to small Air Force design, which led to 2012 and the AT-6 doing an evaluation at the AATC in Tucson by the Air Guard. And so this is either before or after my first flight in the AT-6. Which was a great time, and it was part of the test program, and I did a backseat evaluation. That was my contribution to it, was to evaluate the pilot or the Wizzo vehicle interface in the backseat, which was not as good nearly as it would eventually become. Between this and 2018, the aircraft is going to undergo some major steps, which we will talk about in the Combat Dragon 3 episode, and even more in the Flying the AT-6 episode.
Okay. That's to look forward to. Let me before we end then, because I think we are there. Let me just ask: will we talk at that juncture about L-159 and L-39 for Afghanistan and the reasons behind them saying we don't want L-39 and you saying they're not ready for L-159, or should we do that now?
Oh, we'll do it now because I'm going to totally forget about it. You're going to forget about it. The audience doesn't care anyway.
Okay, so tell us about that. So Honey Badger looks like an interesting airplane. That's the I think the nickname or the name for the L-159. Why didn't they want L-39C, and why didn't you think they were ready for L-159?
So there were actually 3 L-39s on base. And they were simply not cool enough. This is a common mistake for a developing Air Force. They want a cool jet. And I was trying to give them a jet that would match their capabilities to their needs. So the L-39 was a trainer. There were attack variants built with hardpoints. There were upgraded variants that had NATO standard weapons avionics. That's what I thought they should have, was an upgraded L-39. It's the most common jet warbird in the United States.
Hmm.
There's a big market for engine upgrades, for maintenance. There are things you can do to it. There are plenty of companies that do the upgrade work. They're relatively cheap to operate. They cost about $1,000 an hour. They are not high fuel consumption. They are ejection seat aircraft. And the Afghans had pilots who had flown the L-39 before. The L-159 was in the mix because we had NATO advisors, because it was ISAF, it's the International Security Assistance Force, and the NATO advisors were pushing the L-159 because there were no other customers. And they wanted to give them to Afghanistan in order to actually get the U.S. to pay for L-159s that they would then hand off to another Air Force. We weren't prepared to train them. And until they got through a successful light attack with turboprops, they weren't willing to have jets. They weren't ready. They weren't going to be ready. You cannot buy air power off the shelf. Air power has to be built. For Afghanistan and Iraq, we tried to buy them an instant air force, and it didn't work in either case.
Hmm.
In Colombia, we assisted them to build an air force over a decade-long period, and it worked like a champ. We've got the same problems in Iraq, and the people are arguing or in Iraq. We've got the same problems in Ukraine today, and that people that are arguing we should buy the Ukrainians an air force, and you cannot buy air power. You have to build an air power enterprise. So I torpedoed the L-159. One of the things that was going on at the time that was way more influential, I think, than any single thing I did was there was a Navy commander who was trying to teach the air commandos that they needed JTACs and to try and teach them basic CAS procedures. He knew they weren't going to get JTACs, but he might be able to get through forward observers. So he's trying to train forward observers. So it's one of the reasons I think why later, when I went back in 2014, why the Afghan commandos were essentially the only capable military force in the Afghan military. They would retake ground that the Afghan National Army would then lose consistently, but at a slow pace. That's the way operations went afterwards, and that's because the commandos had better training levels, they had more capability, and I really credit an unnamed Navy aviator attached to the headquarters in 2010.
Um, Final question then, just staying on the Afghanistan side of things then. So notwithstanding then your concerns about sort of building somebody or buying somebody in Air Force, what were their, I want to say, human capital sort of qualities? Did they have aviators who were ready to go and start flying? Did they have, were you going to have to take young guys and send them to the States, which I think is what eventually happened when the Afghan Air Force was stood up? What did you have to work with? Who were the sort of personnel that they had available? Because my understanding is that when you guys got to, sort of Bagram and Kabul or whatever it was in October 2001, there were just little MiG-21s and MiG-19s and, well, not MiG-19s, but MiG-17s sitting as wrecks on airfields, and they hadn't flown anything in a long time, and so presumably there was no one current in anything at that point.
No, well, there were still guys that had flown like MiG-21s to the Northern Alliance. So at the
Okay.
time, and unfortunately I can't remember his name, in 2010, the Afghan Air Force commander was actually a Soviet-trained qualified cosmonaut who had fought for everybody. He had flown for the Soviets. He had flown for the post-Soviet Afghan government, essentially the Northern Alliance. He had flown for the Taliban, and now he was flying for the interim government. And he said, I simply cannot have any of my older pilots in this stream because they only ruin the new ones.
Yeah.
So the average Afghan pilot training candidate was above average by American standards. They were typically selected from essentially the upper class, but they had to have their English skills. They had to have their aviation skills. We had to train them from the ground up, but the product was generally good. I did another assessment when I went back to Afghanistan a couple of years later. General Holmes sent me back again in day during his career, sent me into Afghanistan to do an assessment of the 829, which a lot of people, when I wrote it, I held back. I didn't pull any punches, but my shit was accurate. Okay? And naturally, it caused a stir because the last thing you want getting back to the Pentagon is accurate reporting, which is why I was sent out there in the first place. But yeah, so I was impressed by the guys, but you have to realize what you're dealing with is you're building one step at a time, and you teach them to drop bombs and strafe with guns. We were not up to laser guided bomb dropping and so on. But all the air advisors that were there, the Americans that were actually training them, said, pretty much these guys are above average as compared to their equivalents coming out of the U.S. Air Force pilot training. So they went through the 81st Fighter Squadron, 81st Fighter Squadron, which was a Weasel Squadron at Spangdahlem when I was in it, and they were down in Georgia at Moody Air Force Base. That's where they did the Afghan training in 829s. I went into their squadron bar after paying them a visit. The first time I flew the Super Tucano, I think, must have been. And there it is. My name tag is on the Velcro behind the bar from when it was a Weasel Squadron. So that was
Really?
super cool.
Wow.
But yeah, the human capital on the maintenance side was a disaster. I mean, the vast 90% of recruits across the Afghan National Army were illiterate. And the Afghan National Army Air Corps, again, 2010, was trying to pick the cream of the crop. But even the training manuals were having to be redesigned to essentially use more diagrams and less words. Now, one thing the maintenance advisors did tell me is that the Afghans were amazing visual learners
Yeah.
in that you could show them a diagram of all the parts of a turbine engine on a helicopter, and given that to reference, they could rebuild that engine.
Really?
Uh, he just said that um, they had not had an educational process that mirrored ours in any way, and because of that, they had to learn how to pick up things visually, and they were extremely, extremely good at it.
Wow.
So give a guy a manual without pictures and he's lost. Give a guy a bunch of pictures and tools, and it was a different ball game. But they never got away from dependence on U.S. contractors because again, the time frame was too short, and you can't buy air power.
Final question then, and maybe this is something you'll just cover when we talk Combat Dragon 3. So to get the sequence right, next interview is going to be with Hanky. We'll talk Combat Dragon 2, which is the Bronco, the OV-10, and then the 86 and Super Tucano, which is you've already referenced as A29. That will be part 4. So maybe you'll cover this. But why did the Afghan army or the Afghan Air Force end up with A29?
Because they were it was the only light attack aircraft available on the market at the time,
Okay.
because the Brazilians had built it for their own use and sold it to Colombia with the capabilities we wanted. The conversion of the T6, which is a mature airframe, to the AT6 was essentially lagging behind. The other reason, in Starbaby's humble opinion, is that the people who at Air Force Material Command who assessed the A29 for use did not do a thorough or credible assessment of where the aircraft was, not in terms of flashy stuff like the ability to carry ordnance, but in terms of basic aircraft handling manuals and test. So we gave to the Afghans an aircraft that was incompletely tested by US standards. And we didn't even flag that to our own guys.
Really?
Um, it needed a lot of supplementary work from the Embraer factory to bring it up to just change the operational flight program enough so that it was usable for what we wanted to train the guys to do. It's a different design philosophy thing at that stage, but it's also a testing thing. The Brazilians did not do the level of spin testing or asymmetric testing that we would have considered routine. And I think we made an assumption that testing was done and it was not done.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why the A29 came out, is because it looked like it was the most mature weapon system. And we passed over the idea that it was not a mature enough airframe in the way that we would have expected it.
Okay. Well, you will no doubt, and Hanky will join us for that episode anyway. But you will both no doubt go into the ins and outs of all of that stuff. So having said that was my last question. This is my last question, and I know that you follow these kinds of things, so hopefully you'll have an answer of some description. At the handover then of um, the military infrastructure in Afghanistan to the Taliban by the US, well, not ostensibly by the US, a couple of years ago, whenever it was. Did any A29s remain? Had they all been flown west to? Did they go out to Pakistan or neighboring
No,
countries?
um,
And is the Taliban flying them if they're still there?
I haven't got a total count. Um, a bunch of the ones at Kabul were destroyed in place very thoroughly before the last C-17s were flew out. Um, some of the crews escaped up to Mazar-e Sharif, which is a forward operating base. Those aircraft were abandoned in place. Um, but without Brazilian support, the chances of maintaining them and flying them are effectively zero.
Yeah.
And geez, I mean, I'm happy to have Taliban pilots try and fly that thing. Good luck with that. Um, I will give one more preview to Combat Dragon 2, though. So, Combat Dragon 1 was the combat introduction of the A-37 Dragonfly into Vietnam. It was successful. It was a combat demo. So I had proposed Combat Dragon 2 as to General Mattis when he was CENTCOM commander, as an introduction to the AT-6 and the A-29 into Afghanistan. In the process, I made the mistake of making what I thought was common cause with the Navy's development group. And an F-18 pilot who I shall not name, but his name rhymes with dickhead, uh, basically stole Combat Dragon 2 from out under my nose by saying, hey, we have OV-10s that can do this right now. We don't need to go AT-6 or A-29. That was attractive. It was also a line of bull. Okay, the OV-10s they thought they had were not in flyable condition. It took them years to get ones that were in flyable condition. My understanding is they were G models they had to borrow from NASA. But Hanky can no doubt tell you more. So that was I basically had the Combat Dragon 2, the concept stolen out from under me, um, and a line of bull pitched to General Mattis, which he bought. And so again, it ended up making sure that we never did a combat demo of the AT-6 or the A-29 while using the OV-10 to support special operations work, but that was completely non-replicable. Okay, if you took OV-10s out of wherever you managed to find them, you were never going to be able to do what we needed for light attack. So the first stake that was driven, into the vital organs of the light attack proposal was done by guys who essentially bogarted the Combat Dragon 2 for their own special operations purposes. And that leads us up into Hanky in the next episode, where he'll talk about flying the OV-10G in combat.
Nice. And that also leads us to the end then. So that's a nice little liner up for episode 3, and then we will
It
see
is.
you again in
Hanky,
episode
don't screw
4.
this up.
Okay, Starbaby, that's very, very interesting. I know nothing about the ground side of things, so this has been very educational for me. But I'll be honest and say I'm looking forward to getting back to talking about flying.
I know. I mean, I'm trying to make this kind of stuff. It's exciting to me, and it's good stories. I mean, people wanted to know about the Wii search, and there's tons of things they didn't want to know about, like padded shorts. But heck, that's the way it works out.
Oh, there's no doubt this has been entertaining. I mean, any and every Starbaby is entertaining. That's a given. So I just like talking about flying. So